Richard Whitmore laughed, not a quiet, polite laugh, a loud, echoing laugh that bounced off the walls of that courtroom and hit Emily like a slap across the face. He pointed at her old handbag and whispered something to his lawyer, and they both smiled. That laugh, that single cruel laugh, was the moment Richard Whitmore signed his own destruction, and he had absolutely no idea. If this story gives you chills, subscribe to our channel right now, hit the notification bell, and follow Emily's story with us all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the divorce hearing, Emily Carter woke up before her alarm. She lay still in the dark of her small apartment on the east side of Manhattan, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the city waking up outside her window. Taxis, someone's dog barking 2 floors below, the distant groan of a garbage truck making its rounds, normal sounds, ordinary sounds. She had been living in this apartment for 7 months, ever since the night she packed 2 suitcases and walked out of the house on Riverside Drive that she had shared with Richard for 11 years. She had left so quickly that she forgot her favorite coffee mug, a white ceramic mug with a small chip in the handle that she had owned since college. She thought about that mug sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep. It was a strange thing to miss, but grief is strange that way. It doesn't always show up where you expect it. Emily sat up slowly, pressed her feet against the cold hardwood floor, and took one long breath. Today was the day. She walked to the small closet near the bathroom door and pulled out the only formal dress she still owned, a simple black dress she had bought 4 years ago for her friend Clara's mother's funeral. She had worn it exactly once before today. She held it up in front of her in the dim morning light and thought, well, this will have to do. She had no designer clothes anymore. She had sold most of them in the first 3 months after leaving Richard. Not because she had to, not quite yet, but because wearing them had started to feel like wearing his hands around her, like carrying the weight of who he had wanted her to be. She got dressed slowly. She ran a brush through her dark hair, which was longer now than it had been in years. She put on a small pair of pearl earrings, a gift from her mother, one of the only pieces of jewelry she had kept. She picked up the old leather handbag from the kitchen counter, the one with the scratched clasp that she kept meaning to replace, and she stood at her front door for a moment. She was 38 years old. She had a failed business, a nearly empty bank account, and a divorce hearing in 2 hours. And she had a secret so enormous, so life-altering, that it made everything else, the empty account, the small apartment, the scratched handbag, feel almost like a costume, a very convincing costume. She had been wearing it for a long time. The courthouse on Center Street was cold the way government buildings always are, that particular kind of institutional cold that seems to exist independently of the weather outside. Emily walked through the security checkpoint, placed her handbag on the conveyor belt, and watched it disappear through the X-ray machine. A guard on the other side barely looked at her. She was used to that. In the last 7 months, she had become almost invisible. The woman who ran the little bakery on West 72nd Street, or rather the woman who used to run it before it closed, didn't command much attention. She was not the kind of woman people looked at twice, which was she had come to understand both her greatest vulnerability and her most powerful advantage. She took the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down a long corridor until she found courtroom 4B. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The first thing she saw was Richard. He was standing near the front of the room with his lawyers, 3 of them all in dark suits, all holding leather folders, all radiating the particular kind of expensive confidence that comes from knowing someone very rich is paying your hourly rate. Richard himself was wearing a charcoal suit she recognized immediately. He had bought it in Milan on their last trip to Europe together. She remembered sitting in the hotel room while he stood in front of the mirror, turning from side to side, satisfied with his own reflection. She remembered thinking he looked handsome. She didn't think that now. Now she looked at him and felt something much simpler and much cleaner. She felt nothing, or almost nothing. There was a small, distant ache somewhere behind her sternum, the ghost of something that had once been real. But it was faint, fading. Richard turned and saw her, and then he laughed. It came out of him so naturally, so reflexively, that Emily understood immediately it wasn't performed. It wasn't calculated for the room. It was genuine. He looked at her simple black dress, and her scratched handbag, and her plain face with almost no makeup, and he genuinely found her funny. He leaned toward the lawyer on his right, a man named Harrison with silver hair and a reputation for ruthlessness in Manhattan family court, and he said something low and quiet. Harrison's lips twitched. The third lawyer, a young man Emily didn't recognize, looked away quickly as if embarrassed. Emily walked to her seat on the other side of the aisle and sat down. Her own representation that morning was a single attorney named Paul Greer, a decent man she had found through a legal aid referral service. He charged a modest hourly rate and had to his credit worked very hard on her behalf. He sat down beside her and patted the folder of documents on the table in front of him with a kind of optimistic nervousness. "You okay?" Paul asked quietly. "Fine," Emily said. "You don't have to be fine," he said. "This is a hard day." "I know," she said. "I'm fine." She placed her handbag on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands on the table and waited. The Honorable Judge, Patricia Okafor, entered the room at exactly 10 minutes past 9, and everyone rose and then sat again in the ritual shuffle that courts require. Judge Okafor was a compact woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had the manner of someone who had heard every possible variation of human sadness and foolishness and had developed as a result a precise and efficient approach to both. She opened the file in front of her. She looked at both tables. "Carter versus Whitmore," she said. "This is the final hearing on the petition for dissolution of marriage. Both parties are present. We'll begin with Mr. Whitmore's petition. Mr. Harrison." Harrison stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He was the kind of lawyer who made every physical motion feel deliberate, like he was being filmed at all times. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. "The facts of this case are straightforward. My client, Richard Whitmore, entered into a marriage 11 years ago with the respondent, Emily Carter. During that marriage, Mr. Whitmore was the primary financial provider. He supported the household, funded the respondent's business venture, a bakery, and maintained the couple's home on Riverside Drive, valued at approximately $4.2 million. He paused, let the number land. "The bakery failed," Harrison continued. "Not, I would argue, through any fault of market conditions, but due to poor management and a fundamental lack of business acumen on the part of the respondent. In the wake of that failure, the respondent became increasingly unstable, emotionally erratic, and made the marriage untenable for my client." Emily kept her hands folded on the table. She looked straight ahead. "Mr. Whitmore is seeking sole possession of the marital home," Harrison said. "He is seeking the return of funds he personally invested in the respondent's failed business enterprise, and he is seeking a modest maintenance payment to compensate for the disruption this separation has caused to his professional life and personal well-being." Paul Greer wrote something on his notepad. Emily glanced down at it. He had written maintenance payment. "They're actually doing this." She almost smiled. Judge Okafor looked at Paul. "Counsel for the respondent. Response." Paul stood up. He was not Harrison in terms of physical command of a room, but he was careful and he was honest, and Emily had come to trust those qualities more than she trusted performance. "Your Honor," Paul said, "the respondent disputes virtually every characterization offered by opposing counsel. Mr. Whitmore was not the primary financial provider. Mrs. Carter contributed substantially to the household. The bakery's failure was not the result of poor management. We have documentation suggesting that funds were redirected from the business accounts without Mrs. Carter's knowledge or consent." Richard shifted in his seat. "Mrs. Carter is not seeking revenge," Paul continued. "She is seeking what is fair, and she is prepared to demonstrate with evidence that the version of this marriage Mr. Whitmore has presented to this court is not accurate." Harrison was on his feet before Paul had fully sat down. "Your Honor, these are serious allegations without Mr. Harrison." Judge Okafor's voice was not loud, but it stopped him completely. "You will have the opportunity to respond in due course. Sit down." Harrison sat. Emily exhaled very slowly. The first witness Richard's team called was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had served as the business advisor to Emily's bakery, Sweet Sinclair, for the last 2 years of its operation. He was a thin man with nervous hands who kept adjusting his tie as he answered questions. Under Harrison's careful guidance, Gerald painted a picture of Emily as an impulsive, emotionally driven business owner who had ignored his advice at every turn. He described meetings where she had dismissed his financial projections. He described the moment the accounts fell dangerously low, and Emily, he said, had simply wept instead of taking action. "She wasn't a businesswoman," Gerald said. "She was a woman playing at having a business." Richard at his table nodded slowly, satisfied. What Gerald did not know, what he had never been told, was that Emily had kept records, not because she had planned this day exactly, but because she had always kept records. It was a habit she had developed in her early 20s, living alone in New York, learning to rely on no one but herself. She kept everything: bank statements, email threads, text messages, voicemail transcripts. And in those records was a chain of evidence that told a very different story about where the money from Sweet Sinclair had actually gone. Paul cross-examined Gerald for 14 minutes. By the end of it, Gerald's voice had dropped to nearly a whisper, and his hands had gone completely still, which paradoxically made him look more nervous than when they were moving. "Mr. Fitch," Paul said, "were you ever made aware that on 11 separate occasions between March and November of the year, in question transfers were made from the Sweet Sinclair business account to a personal account registered in the name of Whitmore Holdings, LLC?" Silence. Gerald looked at Richard's table. I wasn't directly involved in. Yes or no, Mr. Fitch? Were you aware? No, I wasn't. Thank you, Paul said. No further questions. Richard's second witness was a therapist named Dr. Ann Carver, who had seen Emily twice in the year before the separation. Emily had gone voluntarily when things at home had gotten bad enough that she had finally admitted to herself that she needed to talk to someone. She had not expected those sessions to end up in a courtroom. Dr. Carver appeared uncomfortable on the stand. She answered Harrison's questions carefully, using the controlled language of someone who knew exactly how thin the legal ice beneath her feet was. She acknowledged that Emily had come to her presenting with anxiety and low self-esteem. She acknowledged that Emily had described feeling controlled in her marriage. And in your professional opinion, Harrison said, did these symptoms interfere with the respondent's ability to manage a business? Anxiety can certainly affect executive functioning, Dr. Carver said carefully. Thank you. When Paul rose, he asked one question. Dr. Carver, in your sessions with Mrs. Carter, did she ever describe specific behaviors by her husband that she believed caused or contributed to her anxiety? Dr. Carver hesitated. Yes. What behaviors? Objection, Harrison said. Relevance. Goes directly to the characterization of this marriage that opposing counsel has offered, Paul said. Your Honor, Judge Okafor looked at Dr. Carver. Answer the question, Doctor. Dr. Carver took a breath. Mrs. Carter described her husband monitoring her phone, controlling her access to their shared finances, criticizing her in front of friends and colleagues, and on multiple occasions telling her that she was not capable of surviving without him. The room was very quiet. Richard straightened in his chair. He put a hand flat on the table. Thank you, Paul said. No further questions. The recess came at noon. Emily walked to the small cafeteria on the second floor and sat at a corner table with a cup of coffee she didn't drink. She looked out the window at the street below. People walked past in both directions, going about their ordinary lives, unaware that inside this building, a woman was sitting in the middle of the longest morning of her life. Paul came and sat across from her. We're doing well, he said. Better than I expected, honestly. The account transfers once we present that documentation to the judge. I know, Emily said. Paul studied her. You seem very calm. I am calm. Emily. He leaned forward slightly. Is there anything you haven't told me? Anything that might come up today that I should be prepared for? She looked at him. There was a long pause. There might be, she said. Paul blinked. I'm going to need you to be more specific. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. An unfamiliar number. A 212 area code, Manhattan. She hesitated, then answered. Hello. Ms. Sinclair. The voice was male, older, formal. She went very still. Nobody called her that. Nobody in her current life knew that name. Who is this? She said. My name is Daniel Morgan. I am, or rather, I was the personal attorney of your grandfather, Charles Sinclair. A pause. I apologize for the timing of this call. I have been trying to reach you for several weeks. I understand you are in court today. Emily's fingers tightened around the phone. Ms. Sinclair, your grandfather passed away 9 days ago. I'm sorry for your loss. I know your relationship was complicated. Another pause. I'm calling because he left specific instructions regarding your inheritance, and one of those instructions was that I contact you today, on the day of your divorce hearing. The cafeteria noise, the clattering trays, the muffled conversations seemed to grow very distant. "He knew about the hearing," Emily said. "Your grandfather knew many things," Daniel Morgan said. "He made it his business to know. I realize this is a great deal to absorb, but I need to inform you that Charles Sinclair rewrote his final will 18 months ago, and in that will he made you the sole beneficiary of the Sinclair estate." Emily set the coffee cup down very carefully. "He told me I was removed," she said. "Years ago. He told me that when I married Richard." "He allowed you to believe that," Daniel Morgan said. "I cannot speak to all of his reasons, but his instructions to me were very clear. You are to inherit everything, the full Sinclair estate, Sinclair International in its entirety, the properties, the accounts, the trust funds, all of it." Emily's hand was not entirely steady. She pressed it flat against the table. "There is one condition," Daniel Morgan continued. "The inheritance is contingent on the finalization of your divorce." Charles's instructions were specific. He had concerns. I think you can understand what concerns about the possibility of your husband having any claim to the estate. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Her grandfather, whom she had last spoken to 7 years ago in a telephone call that had lasted 6 minutes and ended with him saying that if she stayed married to Richard Whitmore, she could not expect anything from the family. She had hung up the phone that day feeling something between fury and heartbreak. And now this phone call in a courthouse cafeteria with cold coffee going stale in front of her. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "can you be here this afternoon?" "I'm already in the building," he said. "I'm on the 3rd floor. I've been here since 9 o'clock. Emily opened her eyes. She looked at Paul, who had been watching her face change through the entire phone call with an expression of increasing bewilderment. She said into the phone, "Give me 20 minutes. She hung up. Paul stared at her. "Emily, what just happened?" She picked up her coffee. She finally took a sip of it, even though it was cold. "Do you remember," she said, "when you asked me if there was anything I hadn't told you?" "Yes," Paul said. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. She told him the short version. She had to. There wasn't time for the long version, for the full story of Emily Sinclair, the girl who grew up in a world of marble foyers and private schools and summer homes in the Hamptons and family dinners that felt more like board meetings, the girl who had wanted none of it, who had gone to college on a scholarship she applied for without telling her family because she wanted to know she could earn something on her own, the girl who had met a charming and handsome man named Richard Whitmore at a gallery opening in Tribeca and truly believed that he was the real thing. She told Paul the essential facts. She watched his face move through disbelief, amazement, and then a kind of energized professional focus. "Sinclair International," he said. "You're telling me, yes. The investment firm, the one that, yes. Emily, that company is worth—" He stopped himself. He pressed both hands flat on the table. Okay, we need to go upstairs right now because there is someone I need you to meet, and then we need to go back into that courtroom and I need to understand exactly how this changes our approach." "It doesn't change our approach," Emily said. "Not yet. The inheritance is contingent on the divorce being finalized. So we finish what we started. We present the financial fraud. We get the divorce. And then—" She paused. "And then everything changes," she said. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Your grandfather designed this whole thing, didn't he? He knew Richard would fight the divorce. He knew Richard would try to make claims. So he structured the inheritance to activate only after I'm free," Emily said. Paul sat back in his chair. "He must have loved you very much," he said. Emily looked at the window again. "It took me a long time to see it that way," she said. When they returned to courtroom 4B, Emily sat down in her chair and noticed immediately that something had changed. 2 new people had entered the room. One was Daniel Morgan himself, a silver-haired man in his mid-60s who sat quietly in the public gallery with a briefcase on his lap. The other was a woman. She was seated directly behind the gallery railing near the side door, and she was wearing a dark burgundy blazer with her dark hair pulled back in a precise coil. She held a leather portfolio in one hand, and she was looking at the front of the courtroom with the focused, almost predatory calm of someone who has never walked into a room she wasn't prepared to own. Her name was Victoria Hayes. Emily had heard of her. Most people in Manhattan legal circles had. Victoria Hayes was the kind of attorney whose name appeared in profiles in legal journals in New York Magazine and the financial press when a corporate battle of significant size required a certain kind of representation. She was not the kind of attorney associated with family court proceedings. She was also, Emily now knew, one of the attorneys who handled legal matters for Sinclair International. Richard's lawyer, Harrison, had also noticed the woman. Emily could see at the slight stiffening of his posture, the way he turned his head just far enough to clock the new arrivals, without appearing to actually look at them. Richard himself leaned toward Harrison and said something. Harrison replied without turning around, and something in the set of Harrison's shoulders made Richard go quiet. Judge Okafor returned to the bench. "We're resuming the afternoon session. Mr. Greer, I believe the respondent had planned to present documentation at this time. Are you prepared to proceed?" Paul stood. "Yes, Your Honor, but before we do, I'd like to request a brief sidebar. We have a development." Harrison was on his feet. "Objection to any sidebar at this stage, Your Honor. The petitioner has been waiting all morning for—" "Mr. Harrison," Judge Okafor said. "That's twice now. Do not make me say it a third time." Harrison sat down. His jaw worked briefly. Judge Okafor looked at Paul. 2 minutes, counsel. Make it worth my time." The sidebar lasted 11 minutes, not 2. Emily sat at the respondent's table during those 11 minutes and looked straight ahead and listened to the ambient sounds of the courtroom, the faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of someone's phone vibrating somewhere in the gallery, the quiet shuffling of Richard's legal team rearranging their papers with the controlled agitation of people trying to look unworried. She did not look at Richard. She had made a decision somewhere in the last hour to stop looking at him altogether. Not out of avoidance, out of something different, something she couldn't quite name yet. An understanding maybe that whatever power he had once had over her, the power to make her doubt herself with a look, to make her feel small with a word, that power required her participation. And she was withdrawing her participation. He couldn't laugh at her if she wasn't watching him laugh. When Paul returned from the sidebar, he sat down and placed a single sheet of paper in front of Emily. At the top of the sheet was a name she recognized, Victoria Hayes Esquio, Hayes Sinclair Legal Group. "She's entering her appearance as co-counsel," Paul said quietly. "Judge Okafor has approved it. I'm going to defer the financial documentation presentation to her." Emily looked at the paper. "Paul, this is way above my pay grade," he said quietly. "And I mean that in the most technical and literal sense. Emily, the woman over there handles cases that I read about in journals. Please, let her do what she's here to do." Emily looked at Victoria Hayes, who had moved to the respondent's table and was arranging her papers with brisk efficiency. Victoria looked up and met Emily's eyes. She didn't smile, but there was something in her expression, a brief, precise acknowledgement that said, "I know who you are. I know what this is. And I'm here." Emily nodded once. Victoria turned back to her papers. When Judge Okafor called the court back to order, Victoria Hayes stood up. The room shifted in the way rooms shift when someone of a particular kind of presence stands up in them. It's not theatrical, it's not performed, it's simply the recognition, physical, almost animal, that something significant is about to happen. "Your Honor," Victoria said, "my name is Victoria Hayes. I am entering this proceeding as co-counsel for the respondent, Emily Sinclair Carter." She let that sentence sit for exactly 1 moment. Then she opened her portfolio. Richard's head turned, slowly, like someone who has heard a sound they can't immediately identify. Harrison leaned toward Richard and said something very low. Richard's expression changed. Not dramatically, not yet. Just a small rearrangement, something shifting behind the eyes. "Before we continue with the financial documentation, my colleague Mr. Greer was preparing to present," Victoria said. "I'd like to provide the court with some context that may be relevant to the proceedings. Specifically context regarding the respondent's identity and circumstances." Harrison was on his feet. "Your Honor, the identity of the respondent is not in question. She's Emily Carter, former bakery owner. We have her tax records right here." "She is Emily Carter," Victoria said without raising her voice, without even looking at Harrison. "She is also Emily Sinclair, the granddaughter of Charles Sinclair, the founder of Sinclair International." Silence. Not just quiet. Silence. the specific pressurized silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that doesn't compute and are waiting for their brains to catch up. Richard went completely still. Harrison sat down. Victoria placed a document on the judge's bench. Then she placed a copy on Richard's table. Richard picked it up. Emily watched him read the first paragraph. She watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, not in 11 years of marriage, not in a single moment of all the time she had spent beside him. It went blank. Completely, absolutely blank. The document was a summary of the Sinclair estate probate filing. It named Emily Sinclair Carter as sole beneficiary. It listed the assets under her control upon finalization of the divorce. It included the estimated total value of the inheritance. Richard's hand lowered slowly until the paper rested against the table. His lawyer was reading over his shoulder. Harrison's silver face had gone a particular color, not white, but the off-white of someone whose blood has decided to do something unexpected. "Your Honor," Victoria continued, "Mrs. Sinclair Carter has been negotiating this divorce in good faith, presenting documentation of financial fraud committed against her business by her husband's personal company. I have that documentation as well. But what I want this court to understand at this moment is who exactly is sitting at that table." She gestured toward Emily. "The woman your opposing counsel called a failed businesswoman. The woman your opposing counsel said had nothing. The woman who has been conducting these proceedings with dignity and patience in a courthouse in a simple black dress, while her husband's legal team has attempted to portray her as desperate and incompetent." Victoria paused. "She is the controlling owner of Sinclair International, an investment empire with a net worth exceeding several $billion. She is not here because she needs Richard Whitmore's house. She is here because she is entitled to her freedom, and she would like it now, please." The courtroom erupted. Not dramatically, this was not a film. Courtrooms don't work like films. But there were audible voices suddenly from the gallery, a sharp exhale from somewhere to Emily's left, and Harrison's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up and opened his mouth, and then apparently thought better of whatever he was about to say. Judge Okafor raised her hand. Silence fell immediately. The judge looked at the document. She looked at Emily. She looked at Victoria. Then she looked at Richard. Richard, for the first time in the 11 years Emily had known him, did not look back. He was staring at the paper in his hands, and Emily, watching him, felt the strangest thing. Not triumph, not anger, not the surge of vindication she might have expected. She felt something closer to grief. The grief of watching someone finally see what they had thrown away and knowing they only saw it because of what it was worth, not who she was, what she was worth. That was who Richard had always been. She had just needed a courtroom to see it clearly. The afternoon broke open after that. Harrison recovered his composure and attempted an extraordinary legal maneuver. He argued that because the inheritance had been anticipated during the marriage, because Charles Sinclair had been alive, and the estate had existed during the years of the Carter-Whitmore marriage, Richard was entitled to a marital share. It was a bold argument. It was the kind of argument that required a certain kind of nerve to make. Richard's eyes came alive again when Harrison made it. Emily saw it happen, saw the calculation flicker back into his expression. The familiar look of a man doing math in his head, adding and subtracting, rearranging numbers. "Your Honor," Harrison said, "regardless of the specific timing of the inheritance transfer, the estate was an asset that existed within the context of this marriage. My client," "Your client," Victoria said, cutting in with exact precision, "is welcome to pursue that argument in a separate proceeding, at which point we will be prepared to demonstrate that the estate's transfer is contingent on the prior completion of this divorce as specified in the explicit terms of the Sinclair Trust Agreement." She held up another document. "Which means that at the time of any claim, Mr. Whitmore might make the marriage will no longer exist. The inheritance will have been transferred to a woman who is no longer his wife, and he will have no legal basis whatsoever for any marital claim." Harrison opened his mouth. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, and her voice now had a quality Emily could only describe as surgical, precise, clean, final. "My colleague Mr. Greer will now present documentation showing that Whitmore Holdings LLC made 11 unauthorized transfers from the Sweet Sinclair business account over an 8-month period. The total of those transfers was $243,000. This is not a civil matter. This is fraud. And we will be referring this documentation to the district attorney's office at the conclusion of today's proceedings." Richard's hand, flat on the table, curled very slowly into a fist. "The district attorney's office," Harrison said carefully. "Yes," Victoria said, "the district attorney's office. I'm sure your client is familiar with the concept." Judge Okafor called a 10-minute recess. During that recess, Richard did something Emily had not expected. He crossed the aisle. He walked to her table and he stood in front of her, and Emily looked up at him and waited. He looked she didn't have another word for it, scared. Not the performed concern he sometimes deployed when he needed something from her. Genuinely, fundamentally scared. "Emily," he said. His voice was low. "Can we talk?" "We're talking," she said. "I mean privately, not here. After. We could—" He stopped himself, started again. "I made mistakes. I know I made mistakes. But 11 years, Emily, that means something. We built something together. And if we can just step back from all of this—" "Richard," she said. He stopped. "When you walked into this courtroom this morning," she said, "you laughed at me." He blinked. "You looked at me and you laughed," she said. "Not at something I said, not at something I did. You laughed at what I looked like, at what you thought I had become." He started to speak. "I'm not finished," she said. "You laughed because you thought I was less than you. You thought I was diminished. You thought the years of the things you said to me and the things you did to my business and the way you made me feel, you thought all of that had worked, that you had successfully made me into nothing." She folded her hands on the table. "You didn't make me into nothing," she said. "You never could. And this," she gestured slightly at the room around them, "this isn't about the money. I don't need the money. I never needed the money. This is about the fact that you stole from me. Not the money. You stole my confidence. You stole my sense of myself. You made me spend years believing that my failures were mine alone when you were the one taking the money out the back door." Richard said, "Emily, The marriage is over," she said. "It was over long before today. Today is just the paperwork." He stood there for another moment. Then he walked back to his table. And Emily turned back to her own papers, and she smoothed the front of her simple black dress, and she waited for Judge Okafor to return. Outside the courtroom window, the city went on without them. Taxis, a distant horn, someone's ordinary afternoon. In 11 years of marriage, Emily Carter had forgotten who she was before she became someone's wife. In the last 7 months she had remembered, and now sitting in courtroom 4B with the weight of everything that was coming pressing down on the afternoon like a change in barometric pressure, she knew clearly and calmly, and without a single doubt, that the woman Richard Whitmore had laughed at this morning was going to be the last person he ever underestimated. The recess ended. Judge Okafor returned. The afternoon was just beginning. Judge Okafor's gavel came down once clean and final, and the courtroom settled back into the specific kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Richard had returned to his seat. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. But his eyes were doing something Emily recognized from 11 years of watching that face. They were calculating, running numbers, looking for the exit in a room that had just had all its doors closed. Harrison leaned toward him and spoke directly into his ear for nearly 30 seconds. Richard listened without moving. Then he gave one short nod. Whatever Harrison had just told him, Richard had decided it was enough. He had decided he still had a play. Emily knew that look too. Victoria Hayes was already at the respondents' table arranging documents with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found it neither exciting nor intimidating. She placed a yellow legal pad to her left, uncapped a pen, and looked up at Judge Okafor with the calm attention of a surgeon waiting for the first incision. Paul Greer sat beside Emily, his own folder open, his hand slightly unsteady as he turned to the financial documentation they had spent 3 weeks assembling. He had prepared for a difficult day. He had not prepared for this day. Nobody could have prepared for this day. "Mrs. Carter," Paul said quietly without looking up from his papers. "How are you holding up?" "Ask me in an hour," Emily said. He almost smiled. Almost. Judge Okafor looked down at the documents Victoria had submitted. She read without expression, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, one finger moving slightly along the lines of text. The courtroom waited. Richard's youngest attorney, the one Emily didn't recognize, the one who had looked away earlier when Richard laughed, was watching Victoria Hayes with an expression that was somewhere between professional assessment and frank apprehension. He had recognized her. Of course he had. Every lawyer under 40 who had gone through a good law school in New York had studied at least one of Victoria Hayes's cases. She was not someone you wanted to see walk into a room on the opposite side. Finally, Judge Okafor set the documents down. "Ms. Hayes," she said, "the court has reviewed the preliminary filing. I want to understand the timeline. The decedent Charles Sinclair passed away 9 days ago. That is correct, Your Honor. And the will was rewritten 18 months prior. 18 months and 4 days, yes. And the condition of finalized divorce was written explicitly into the inheritance structure. It was, Your Honor. I have the original trust document, the amendment, and the signed attestation of 2 independent witnesses and a notary, all filed with the probate court in Manhattan as of this morning." Judge Okafor looked at Harrison. "Counsel, do you wish to contest the validity of the document?" Harrison stood. He had recovered some of his composure, Emily noticed. He had straightened his jacket and rearranged his expression into something more measured, more strategic. He was a professional. He had been in difficult positions before. He was adjusting. "Your Honor," Harrison said, "we do not contest the existence of the document. We contest the characterization of its implications for this proceeding. The petitioner's position is that any inheritance anticipated or structured during the course of the marriage, regardless of technical transfer timing, constitutes a marital asset." Victoria did not stand. She spoke from her seat, which somehow made her sound more authoritative, not less. "The petitioner's position is creative," she said. "It is not, however, supported by statute precedent or any rational reading of New York inheritance law." Harrison's voice tightened. "If Ms. Hayes will allow me to finish, I'm simply noting," Victoria said, still seated, still calm, "that if Mr. Harrison intends to argue that a conditional inheritance, one that did not and could not exist until after this divorce, constitutes a marital asset, he is welcome to make that argument. I have 17 cases ready to go that say otherwise. We can be here until Thursday." Harrison looked at Judge Okafor. "Your Honor." "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, "I've read the document. I understand the structure. The inheritance is contingent on finalization. That is not a gray area." She set her glasses down on the bench. "Let's move forward. Mr. Greer, you have financial documentation to present." Paul stood immediately. "Yes, Your Honor." He opened the folder, and the second half of the day began. The documentation Paul presented over the next 40 minutes told a story. Not a complicated story. The facts laid out in sequence were almost stark in their simplicity. But the effect was cumulative, and Emily watched it land piece by piece on the courtroom, on the judge, and most importantly on Richard. It started with the bank records. 11 transfers, March through November, each one originating from the Sweet Sinclair business account. Each one routing to Whitmore Holdings, LLC, a company registered in Delaware that Richard had set up 4 years ago without ever mentioning it to Emily. The amounts ranged from $8,000 to $42,000. The total, as Victoria had stated, $243,000. $243,000 that Emily had believed was going towards supplier invoices, equipment, maintenance, staff, wages, and all the ordinary expenses of running a small business. $243,000 that had instead been quietly, methodically redirected into her husband's personal corporate account. The judge studied each transfer record individually. Harrison objected 3 times during Paul's presentation. Judge Okafor overruled him 3 times. By the 3rd objection, she didn't even look up from the documents before saying it. Richard sat very still through all of it. He had gone somewhere inside himself, somewhere private and contained, and Emily had the disconcerting sense that he was not watching the presentation of evidence against him so much as he was doing what he always did when cornered. He was thinking about how to make this someone else's problem. Then Paul produced the emails. This was the part Emily had not told Paul about until 2 days ago. The part she had found by accident 3 months after leaving, when she had finally gotten around to logging into an old cloud backup she had forgotten she maintained. She had set it up years ago at a friend's suggestion, an automatic backup of every device on their home network. She had forgotten about it almost immediately, but it had kept running silently in the background, capturing everything, including Richard's emails. Not all of them, but enough. The relevant ones were between Richard and Gerald Fitch, the same Gerald Fitch who had sat on that witness stand this morning and described Emily as a woman playing at having a business. In those emails, Gerald and Richard discussed the transfers. Not in explicit terms, they were careful in the way that people who know they are doing something wrong are always careful, using vague language referencing, reallocation, and temporary bridging, and administrative adjustments. But the pattern was clear, the intent was clear, and in one email sent at 11:47 at night, which Emily had noticed because 11:47 at night was a time she remembered Richard being particularly cruel to her about the bakery's declining numbers in that email Richard had written to Gerald. She doesn't look at the accounts closely enough to notice. Keep the amounts under 50 and rotate the descriptions. Paul read that sentence aloud. He didn't editorialize. He just read it, and then he set the paper down, and there was a silence in the courtroom that lasted exactly 4 seconds before Harrison erupted from his chair. Your Honor, those emails were obtained without my client's knowledge or consent and may constitute an illegal. They were captured by a network backup system to which my client had equal and documented access, Paul said. As a co-owner of the marital home and a shared network user, the legality of the capture is unambiguous. I have a memorandum from a digital forensics expert confirming the chain of custody if the court would like to review it. I would, Judge Okafor said. Paul produced the memorandum. Harrison sat down. Richard looked at Harrison. Harrison looked at the table. The young attorney at the end of Richard's table was no longer watching Victoria Hayes. He was watching his own hands. Emily exhaled, slowly, controlled. She had carried that email for weeks. She had read it so many times she could have recited it from memory. She doesn't look at the accounts closely enough to notice. She had read it in the dark of her small apartment on the east side of Manhattan, in the hours when the city was quiet enough that she could hear her own heartbeat, and she had felt what anger, yes. But underneath the anger, something worse. The retroactive understanding of exactly how little she had been regarded, not just as a wife, as a person, as a mind. She doesn't look closely enough to notice. 11 years, and that was his assessment. She was looking closely enough now. Gerald Fitch was recalled to the stand at 2:30 in the afternoon. He came back to the courtroom with the bearing of a man walking towards something unavoidable. His nervous hands from the morning session had stopped moving entirely and were now pressed together in his lap, which, as Emily had observed earlier, actually made him look more frightened. Victoria Hayes conducted this examination personally. She stood at the lectern and looked at Gerald Fitch with the patient attention of someone who has read every piece of paper relevant to the next 30 minutes and is simply waiting for the other person to understand what that means. Mr. Fitch, she said, you testified this morning that Emily Carter's bakery failed due to poor management. Yes, that was my assessment. Was it also your assessment when you and Richard Whitmore exchanged emails discussing how to rotate transfer descriptions so they would not be detected? Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. We were... He stopped, tried again. Those communications were, yes or no, Mr. Fitch. Were you aware during those email exchanges that the funds being transferred had originated in the Sweet Sinclair business account? A long pause, a terrible pause. Yes, Gerald said. The gallery murmured. Were you aware that Emily Carter had not authorized those transfers? Another pause, shorter this time, as if Gerald had made a decision. Yes, he said. Harrison's pen hit the table. Richard's head turned toward his lawyer with an expression Emily had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation. Something rawer than both. Something close to panic. Mr. Fitch, Victoria continued, are you currently employed by Whitmore Holdings, LLC? Gerald looked at his hands. I was, until 2 weeks ago. And why did that employment end? I was asked to. Mr. Whitmore indicated that my services were no longer... Gerald stopped, swallowed. He let me go. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Victoria repeated. Shortly after Mrs. Carter's attorney indicated he intended to present financial documentation at today's hearing. The timing landed in the room like something physical. I don't know the exact... Thank you, Mr. Fitch, Victoria said. No further questions. She returned to her seat. She uncapped her pen. She wrote one line on her legal pad. Emily couldn't see what it said. She didn't need to. She could feel the momentum in the room the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, not yet, but the absolute certainty that it is coming. Gerald Fitch stepped down from the stand. He did not look at Richard as he walked past. He walked directly to the back of the courtroom, picked up his jacket from the gallery bench, and left without stopping. Richard watched him go. The door to the courtroom closed. And Emily thought, there it is. There is the moment when a man realizes that the people he surrounded himself with were never loyal to him. They were loyal to his money, to his certainty, to the sense that being close to him was safe. The moment that certainty cracked, Gerald Fitch walked out the door. Richard had spent 11 years making Emily feel like she needed him to survive. It turned out he was the one who couldn't keep anyone in the room. Harrison called for a brief recess. Judge Okafor granted 15 minutes. Richard and his lawyers retreated to the small consultation room adjacent to the courtroom. Emily could not hear what was being said inside, but she could see through the small window in the consultation room door the body language of 3 men in a room where the situation had shifted irrevocably, and nobody wanted to be the first to say so. Harrison was talking, rapidly, his silver head moving, his hands gesturing. The young attorney was taking notes. Richard was standing with his back to both of them, facing the wall. Emily turned away. Paul brought her a glass of water from the carafe on the respondent's table. Victoria was on her phone speaking in a low, rapid voice. Emily caught fragments. District Attorney, Financial Crimes Division, Monday morning. She nodded twice, said something Emily didn't catch, and hung up. That was the DA's office, Victoria said, setting the phone face down on the table. Already, Paul said. I called them this morning, Victoria said. Before the hearing, I wanted to have the referral ready to file the moment we had Gerald Fitch's testimony on the record. She looked at Emily. The financial fraud alone is a significant exposure for your husband. The DA will decide how aggressively to pursue it, but the documentation is strong, very strong. Emily held the glass of water without drinking it. What happens to him? Victoria's expression was precise, unreadable. That depends on a number of factors. The amounts are substantial. The pattern is deliberate. There's documentary evidence of intent. She paused. He should have very good lawyers. He does have very good lawyers, Emily said. Victoria looked at her. He has Harrison. Harrison is very good at one particular kind of case. This is no longer that kind of case. The recess ended. Richard came back into the courtroom, and he looked different. Emily noticed it immediately. He had done something in those 15 minutes, assembled something around himself, some final layer of control, and he walked to his chair and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man carrying something fragile. He still did not look at Emily. Harrison approached the bench. Your Honor, the petitioner would like to revise his position on the marital home. Judge Okafor looked up. Revise. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to withdraw his claim to sole possession. He would propose instead he's withdrawing the claim to the house, Paul said, audibly surprised. The petitioner is revising, Harrison began. Your Honor, Victoria said, rising to her feet. With respect, any revision to the petitioner's claims at this stage, after a full morning of testimony and evidence, should be treated as what it is, a strategic retreat in response to the evidence presented, not a genuine reconsideration. The respondent's position has not changed. We are seeking dissolution of the marriage. We are not seeking the house, the maintenance payment, or any of the petitioner's assets. We are seeking specifically and only finalization of the divorce, today. Judge Okafor looked at Harrison. Counsel! Harrison glanced at Richard. Richard gave a small nod. The petitioner does not oppose finalization, Harrison said. The young attorney at the end of the table wrote something quickly on his notepad and underlined it twice. Good, Judge Okafor said. She picked up her pen. Then let's address the outstanding matters. The fraud documentation will be formally entered into the record and a copy provided to the district attorney's office. The marital home, what is the current status of the mortgage? Paul answered. The mortgage is held in both names. Mrs. Carter's position is that she does not seek possession of the property. She is prepared to quit-claim her interest in exchange for a clean separation of all shared accounts and Mr. Whitmore's written acknowledgement that the business loan he alleges he provided to Sweet Sinclair was in fact money taken without authorization and does not constitute a debt owed by Mrs. Carter. Harrison leaned toward Richard. Richard closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then he opened them. Petitioner agrees, Harrison said. It happened so quickly that Emily almost didn't register it. 11 years of marriage, $243,000 stolen from her business. A courtroom performance that had begun with laughter and a pointed finger. Petitioner agrees. 2 words, delivered by a silver-haired lawyer in a $5,000 suit on behalf of a man who could not bring himself to say them directly. Emily's hands were folded on the table in front of her. She felt Paul's hand rest briefly on her arm, a quick professional touch, the kind that says we did it. But she was not finished, because there was still one moment left, and she had known since the phone call in the cafeteria that it was coming, and she had been carrying it with her through the afternoon, like something she had agreed to hold until the right moment. Victoria stood. "Your Honor, I have one final matter before the court enters the dissolution order." Judge Okafor looked at her. "The respondent requests that the record reflect clearly and permanently that the inheritance from the Sinclair estate is her sole property, acquired post-dissolution, with no marital component and no claim by the petitioner. We are requesting a declaratory statement entered into this record today." Harrison was on his feet. "Your Honor, we object to." "On what grounds, Mr. Harrison?" Judge Okafor said. Harrison opened his mouth, closed it. "On what grounds?" the judge repeated. The silence stretched. Harrison sat down. "I'll enter the declaratory statement," Judge Okafor said. She began writing. "Let the record reflect that the inheritance received by the respondent, Emily Sinclair Carter, from the estate of Charles Sinclair, is her sole and separate property, acquired subsequent to and contingent upon the dissolution of the marriage, and constitutes no part of any marital estate." She set her pen down. "Is there anything further from either party?" Richard spoke. For the first time since Gerald Fitch had walked out the door, Richard Whitmore spoke without his lawyer. "Emily," he said. His voice was different. Not the voice from this morning, not the loud performing voice that had filled this courtroom with laughter. This voice was smaller, private, the voice of a man in a room that had gotten very quiet. Emily looked at him. For the first time since she had decided to stop watching him, she looked directly at him. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out flat, not rehearsed. Emily knew what Richard's rehearsed apologies sounded like, and this was not that. This was something stripped of performance. Whether it was genuine or simply the sound of a man who had finally run out of moves, she couldn't entirely tell. Maybe it didn't matter. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly and without cruelty, "I know you are." She turned back to the judge. Richard said nothing else. Judge Okafor looked at both tables. She folded her hands. "The court finds that the marriage between Emily Sinclair Carter and Richard Whitmore is irretrievably broken, and that the parties have reached resolution on all outstanding matters. The court hereby enters a judgment of dissolution of marriage, effective immediately. All terms as agreed and entered into the record are binding." She picked up the stamp. She pressed it to the document. The sound it made was small. A single mechanical click of rubber against paper. And then it was done. Emily sat very still and let the fact of it move through her. 11 years. Reduced in the end to a stamped document and a small sound in a room with fluorescent lighting and a view of the street. She had expected to feel more. She had braced herself over the past 7 months for the moment the dissolution became official, braced for grief or relief or anger or some enormous rush of feeling that would confirm the magnitude of what she had just ended. Instead, she felt quiet. Not empty, not hollow. Quiet in the way that a room is quiet after everyone has gone home and the last light has been turned off. Not absence, but stillness. The particular stillness of something that is finally over. Paul was shaking her hand, saying something. She nodded. Victoria was already standing, gathering her documents with practiced efficiency, speaking quietly into her phone again. She glanced at Emily once, that same brief, precise look from earlier. Then she nodded once and went back to her phone. Daniel Morgan was making his way from the gallery toward the respondent's table. He was a tall man with careful movements and the manner of someone who has spent decades in rooms where significant things happen and has learned not to let them show on his face. He stopped in front of Emily and extended his hand. "Ms. Sinclair," he said. She shook it. "Congratulations is the wrong word for a day like this," he said. "But your grandfather would have been proud of you today." Emily looked at him. "He would have been pleased that his plan worked," she said. Daniel Morgan allowed a very small smile. "Yes," he said. "That too. He was a man who enjoyed being right." He paused. "He also watched you for a long time, Mrs. Sinclair, from a distance. He saw what this man put you through, and I want you to know he was not indifferent to it. He was of a generation that expressed care in particular ways. By designing elaborate legal structures," Emily said. "Yes," Daniel Morgan said. "Precisely that." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the laugh and the fact that it was real. "There's a great deal to go over," Daniel said. "When you're ready, there's no rush. The estate will wait for you." "Tomorrow," Emily said. "We'll start tomorrow." He nodded. He stepped back. He left the way he had come. Emily picked up her handbag from the floor beside her chair. The old one, the scratched clasp, the one Richard had gestured at this morning as a punchline. She stood up. Harrison was escorting Richard toward the side door. Richard walked with his jacket buttoned and his shoulders set, still performing even now some version of dignity. His two remaining lawyers followed a half step behind like a diminished entourage. At the door, Richard paused. He did not turn around. He stood there for 3 full seconds with his hand on the door frame. Emily could see the side of his face from where she was standing. She could see his jaw working slightly the way it did when he was fighting something down. Then he pushed the door open and walked through it. The door swung closed behind him, and Emily stood in the middle of courtroom 4B in her simple black dress with her scratched handbag over her shoulder and the stamped dissolution order sitting on the table behind her, and the full weight of the Sinclair estate pressing down on her future like a key she had not yet decided how to use. She was free. Not just from the marriage, from the version of herself that the marriage had tried to create, the diminished version, the uncertain version, the version that woke up every morning and did a small automatic audit of her own worth and always found herself coming up short. She was done with that version. She picked up her phone from the table, scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in 14 months. Her friend Clara, who had been her closest friend before the marriage, swallowed most of Emily's friendships, the way controlling relationships always do, quietly and incrementally, until one day you look up and realize you are completely alone. She pressed call. Clara answered on the second ring. "Emily." Her voice was careful, hoping. "It's over," Emily said. A pause. Then very quietly, "Oh, thank God." "I need a drink," Emily said. "I need a real drink, and I needed to sit across from someone who knew me before all of this, and I need to talk about something completely ordinary for at least 2 hours. Can you do that?" "I'm already getting my coat," Clara said. Emily smiled. She walked toward the courtroom door, the same door she had walked through that morning as the woman everyone expected to lose. She pushed it open. She walked through. Behind her, the courtroom was already emptying. The bailiff was stacking papers. A clerk was turning off one of the overhead lights. The whole machinery of the morning was being cleared away, reset, made ready for the next case and the next story, and the next human life that would walk through those doors carrying its particular weight of hope and damage. But Emily was no longer inside it. She was in the corridor, and then she was at the elevator, and then she was in the lobby, and then she was outside on the sidewalk on Center Street, and the city hit her all at once, the noise of it, the movement, the absolute indifference of a city that does not stop for anyone's private revolution. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. A taxi honked. A woman in a yellow raincoat walked past talking on her phone. 2 kids on the corner were arguing loudly about something that would be resolved and forgotten by dinner. Ordinary life, going on without pause. She had forgotten how much she loved it. The ordinary weight of it. The sheer anonymous momentum of a city that expected nothing from her and would give her everything if she was brave enough to take it. Emily Sinclair took one more breath and walked into it. The drink with Clara lasted 4 hours. They sat in a corner booth at a bar on West 4th Street that Clara had been going to since graduate school, the kind of place with sticky menus and good bourbon and bartenders who don't hover. Emily drank 2 glasses of wine and ate half a plate of fries and really talked for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure. Clara sat across from her with both elbows on the table and listened, the way she had always listened, completely without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just fully present in the way that certain people are and most people aren't. When Emily finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So let me get this straight. You walked into that courtroom this morning with a scratched handbag and left it as the heir to a billion-dollar empire." "Approximately," Emily said. "Approximately billion." "Yes." Clara picked up her glass. "Emily Sinclair," she said, "you are the most dramatic person I have ever loved." Emily laughed. "The real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere low in the chest and surprises you on the way out." "I didn't plan any of it," she said. "I know," Clara said. "That's what makes it dramatic." She set her glass down and her expression shifted, became more careful, more serious. "How do you actually feel? Not the lawyer version. Not the composed version. How do you actually feel right now? Emily thought about it honestly. She looked at the table for a moment, at the ring of condensation her wine glass had left on the old wood. Like I've been holding my breath for 11 years, she said, and I just exhaled. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. They stayed like that for a moment without speaking. The bar noise went on around them, a jukebox somewhere, two men laughing at the counter, a woman's voice rising and falling in the booth adjacent. Ordinary life doing what it always does. What happens now? Clara asked. Tomorrow, Emily said, I go meet with Daniel Morgan and find out exactly what I've inherited. And after that, Emily looked up. I have absolutely no idea, she said, and for the first time in a very long time, that doesn't scare me. That night, she slept 8 hours straight, through which she had not done in months. She didn't dream about the courtroom. She didn't dream about Richard. She dreamed about the bakery Sweet Sinclair before everything went wrong, the smell of the ovens in the morning, the weight of the dough under her hands, the particular satisfaction of making something real out of raw materials. She woke up at 6:30 with that feeling still on her, warm and specific. She made coffee. She stood at the window of her small apartment and watched the city wake up below her. Then she got dressed and went to meet Daniel Morgan. His offices were on the 43rd floor of a building on Park Avenue, which was a neighborhood Emily had grown up adjacent to, but had deliberately kept herself away from in the years of her marriage. Richard had wanted to live on the Upper East Side. Emily had steered them toward Riverside Drive instead, a small act of quiet resistance that she hadn't fully understood at the time. She stepped out of the elevator into a reception area that was the architectural version of old money, understated, expensive calm. A young woman at the front desk looked up. Ms. Sinclair, she said, as if she had been expecting her, as if Emily Sinclair was a name that belonged in this building, on this floor, in this world. Emily had spent 11 years talking herself out of that feeling. It took effort now not to talk herself out of it again. Daniel is ready for you, the woman said. She led Emily down a hallway and into a conference room where Daniel Morgan was already seated along with two other people Emily didn't recognize. One was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and an accountant's precision about her posture. The other was a younger man with a tablet in front of him, already open, already running. Daniel stood when Emily entered. Ms. Sinclair, thank you for coming. Emily, she said. Please. He nodded. Emily. He gestured to the chair across from him. This is Margaret Chu. She's been the CFO of Sinclair International for the past 12 years. And this is James Park, who handles our technology and data infrastructure. Emily shook hands with both of them. Margaret Chu had a firm handshake and assessed Emily in the brief, efficient way of someone who has no time for anything that is not relevant. I want to start, Emily said, before Daniel could begin his prepared remarks, by being honest with you. I know the company exists. I know roughly what it does. I have not been involved with it in any capacity for over a decade. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Margaret Chu's expression shifted, not dramatically, but something in it relaxed. Good, she said. That's a better starting position than I was expecting. Daniel opened a folder. Your grandfather's instructions regarding the transition were very specific. He did not expect you to step in and run operations immediately. He expected a learning period. He described it as, he scanned the document and read a brief passage, a period of intelligent observation before intelligent action. That sounds like him, Emily said. He also left you a letter, Daniel said. He slid an envelope across the table. It was a cream-colored envelope with her name written on the front in handwriting she recognized immediately. She had not seen that handwriting in 7 years. It was the same handwriting that had appeared on birthday cards when she was a child, precise, slightly formal. The handwriting of a man who had taught himself penmanship as a young person and considered it a mark of character. Emily looked at the envelope. You can read it privately, Daniel said quietly. There's no rush. Tell me about the company first, Emily said. She set the envelope down beside her. What am I actually inheriting, not the number, the reality? Margaret Chu leaned forward, and for the next 2 hours she told her. Sinclair International was not Emily discovered the abstract financial empire she had vaguely imagined. It was a specific complex organism, 17 active investment portfolios across 4 sectors, a real estate division with properties in 8 cities, a venture capital arm that had made early investments in 11 companies that had since become significant players in their fields. It had 612 employees across 3 offices. It had a board of directors, several of whom had been with the company for over 20 years, and several of whom had joined in the last 3 years, and were still, Margaret said carefully, finding their footing in terms of cultural alignment. It had a current net worth as of the most recent valuation of $4.3 billion. Emily sat with that number. She had known it was coming, Victoria had said billions, and Daniel's filing had confirmed it, but hearing it stated plainly by a CFO across a conference table was a different experience from knowing it abstractly. It was the difference between reading that a mountain is 20,000 feet tall and standing at its base. "The board will want to meet you," Margaret said. "Some of them are going to be cautious. There are 2 members in particular who have been with the company since your grandfather founded it, and they have strong opinions about leadership continuity." "Who are they?" Emily asked. "Arthur Wren and Patricia Gale. Arthur was your grandfather's first business partner. He holds a non-voting advisory seat, but his influence on the other board members is significant. Patricia is a voting member. She controls enough institutional relationships that her support or opposition will shape the board's initial response to your assuming control." "What was their expectation?" Emily said. "Before they knew about me?" Margaret and Daniel exchanged a brief look. "There were discussions," Daniel said carefully, "about the possibility of an external hire, a professional CEO to manage operations while the estate was settled." "Someone they chose?" Emily said. "Someone Arthur Wren had already identified," Margaret said. Emily nodded slowly. "And now the will is unambiguous," Daniel said. "Controlling interest goes to you. The board cannot override that. But the board can make your tenure significantly easier or significantly harder, depending on whether they decide to work with you or around me," Emily said. "That's one way to put it." Emily looked at Margaret. "What do you think, honestly?" Margaret Chu had the look of someone who appreciated being asked direct questions and had made a career out of answering them. "I think the company needs leadership that understands what it actually is, not what it looks like on a prospectus. Your grandfather understood that. He built this thing from $40,000 and a handshake deal in 1971, and he never forgot what it cost him. The board has started to forget." She paused. "I don't know yet if you're the right person, but I know that Arthur Wren's candidate absolutely wasn't." Emily looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like to schedule the board meeting for next week." Daniel blinked. "Next week may be fast," Emily said. "I know. I want it fast on purpose. I'm not going to give anyone time to organize opposition before I've had a chance to speak for myself." Margaret Chu was quiet for a moment. Then something in her expression shifted definitively toward something that might have been respect. "I'll arrange it," she said. After Margaret and James left, Emily sat alone in the conference room with Daniel Morgan and the cream-colored envelope. "Tell me about the last 18 months, she said. "After he changed the will, what was he like?" Daniel considered the question with care. "He was quieter than he had been. He made the changes to the trust, gave me his instructions regarding you, and then he spent a great deal of time getting his other affairs in order. He sold the house in the Hamptons. He gave away a significant number of his personal possessions, not randomly, deliberately. Each one went to someone specific with a specific reason." "What did he give away?" Emily asked. "Books mostly, his personal library, and his watch collection. He gave each watch to someone who had worked for him at some point and had shown what he called persistence in difficult circumstances." Daniel paused. "He gave one watch to a woman who had been his housekeeper for 30 years. He gave another to a young analyst who had made a significant error in a presentation, and rather than hiding it, had come directly to Charles and told him about the mistake before anyone else noticed." Emily looked at the envelope. "He admired honesty," she said. "Above almost everything else," Daniel said. She picked it up. "I'll give you a moment," Daniel said, and stepped out. Emily sat alone in this conference room on the 43rd floor and held the envelope her grandfather had addressed to her before he died, knowing exactly what day she would open it, knowing she would be sitting somewhere quiet after the divorce was finalized, knowing her, knowing her well enough across the distance of 7 years of silence to understand what she would need from him in this moment. She opened it. The letter was 2 pages handwritten in that precise and slightly formal penmanship she remembered from childhood birthday cards. She read it slowly. She did not rush it. She would not afterward share the full contents of that letter with anyone. Not Daniel, not Clara, not the people who would later write about her in business profiles. The letter was hers. It was the most private thing she owned. But there was one paragraph she carried with her from that morning forward, something she returned to in the months ahead, whenever the ground felt uncertain beneath her feet. Her grandfather had written, "I was wrong to give you an ultimatum. I gave you one because I was afraid of losing you to a man who didn't deserve you, and unable to find any other way to express that fear. I am sorry it took me this long to say so. Go build something worth being proud of. You always knew how. You just needed to remember." She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she stood up, smoothed the front of her jacket, and went to find Daniel Morgan. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning. In the 6 days between that decision and its execution, Emily did not sleep much, but she was not awake in the old way, the anxious, grinding insomnia of the marriage years lying beside Richard and listening to him breathe and cataloging her own failures in the dark. She was awake in a different way, a productive way. She was reading, she was learning. She was calling Margaret Chu at 7 in the morning with questions and calling her again at 10 at night with more. And Margaret, who Emily was rapidly coming to understand was one of the most competent people she had ever encountered, answered every single one. She read every quarterly report Sinclair International had published in the last 4 years. She read the minutes from the last 8 board meetings. She read the investment theses for 3 of the major portfolio positions and the postmortems on 2 that had underperformed. She read everything. She also on the 3rd day called Victoria Hayes. "Richard," she said when Victoria answered, "what's happening?" A brief pause. "The DA's office made contact yesterday. They're treating it as a formal inquiry for now. They haven't filed charges yet. Harrison has already retained a criminal defense attorney, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they're taking it internally. How long will it take? The inquiry months. If they file charges longer. Financial fraud cases of this complexity don't move quickly." Victoria paused. "Are you asking because you're worried about him?" "No," Emily said. "I'm asking because I want to know what I might be asked about, as a witness. Almost certainly you will be asked to testify about the business accounts. Your financial records will be subpoenaed. Your testimony will be significant given the email evidence." Another pause. "Emily, you should know. Harrison called me this morning." Emily went still. "About what?" "Richard wants to settle. He's proposing through Harrison to return the $243,000 to you directly in exchange for your agreement not to cooperate with the DA's investigation." The word for what Emily felt in that moment was not anger. It was something colder and cleaner than anger. It was clarity. "No," she said. "I thought that would be your answer," Victoria said. "I wanted you to hear the offer before I declined on your behalf. The answer is no, now and if he asks again." "Understood." Emily ended the call and sat for a moment at the small desk in her apartment where she had set up a makeshift workspace, legal pads, printed reports, 2 highlighters, a coffee that had gone cold. Richard wanted to buy her silence. With her own money. Money he had taken from her while telling her she wasn't capable of managing it herself. She picked up the cold coffee, drank it anyway. Then she picked up the next quarterly report and kept reading. Thursday arrived with a gray sky and the kind of damp cold that settles into a city in late autumn and refuses to leave. Emily woke at 5. She made coffee. She sat with it and did not look at her notes. She had read enough. She knew what she needed to know. What she needed now was not more information. It was something else. The thing her grandfather had written about in the letter. The thing she had spent 11 years forgetting she had. She got dressed. Dark suit, structured, well-cut. She had bought it 4 days ago at a department store, the first piece of genuinely good clothing she had allowed herself since leaving Richard. Pearl earrings, her mother's. The scratched handbag she had deliberately left at home. She arrived at the Sinclair International building at 8:45. Margaret Chu was already in the lobby. "The board is assembled," Margaret said. "All 11 members. Arthur Wren is here." "Good," Emily said. "He's been talking to 3 of the newer members since 8 o'clock this morning. In the small conference room on 22. Margaret said it neutrally, but the information was not neutral. What's he telling them? I don't know specifically. I know his candidate, a man named Forsyth, who ran a mid-size investment group in Chicago until last year, is waiting in the building, on the 17th floor. Emily looked at her. Forsyth is in the building. Arthur likes to be prepared. Emily thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Which floor is the board meeting on?" 38. "Can you take me to 22 first?" Margaret blinked. 2. "If Arthur Wren has been preparing for an hour," Emily said, "I'd like to introduce myself before we're across a boardroom table from each other. I find it's harder for people to work against you if they've had to look you in the eye first." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she pressed the elevator button for 22. The small conference room on the 22nd floor had a glass wall facing the corridor, which meant Emily could see the 3 people inside before she opened the door. Arthur Wren was at the head of the table, a man in his late 70s with white hair and the upright posture of someone who had decided decades ago that he would not let age curve his spine. The 2 board members with him were younger, a man in his mid-50s, who Emily recognized from the board minutes as Lawrence Holt, and a woman about the same age named Susan Chen. Arthur Wren was talking. His hands moved as he spoke, not nervously, but with the expressive assurance of someone who has been making arguments in rooms like this for half a century. Lawrence Holt was in front of her. Emily opened the door. All 3 heads turned. Arthur Wren stopped mid-sentence. Emily walked in. "Mr. Wren," she said, "I'm Emily. I know we're due upstairs in 10 minutes, but I wanted to introduce myself first. My grandfather spoke well of you. He said you were the only person who ever told him directly when he was wrong." Arthur Wren stared at her. "He told me that in a letter he left me," she continued. "He also said that when you told him he was wrong, you were usually right. He considered that your most valuable quality." The room was very still. Arthur Wren had the face of a man who had just been handed something he wasn't expecting and was deciding rapidly what to do with it. He had prepared for confrontation. He had prepared for deference, which he would have respected less than confrontation, but found easier to manage. He had not prepared for this, a woman walking through his door 11 minutes before a board meeting and leading with his best quality. "Your grandfather," he said finally, "was a complicated man." "Yes," Emily said. "He was. So am I." She looked at Lawrence Holt, then Susan Chen. "I know you've had concerns about the transition. I know there are questions about whether I'm equipped to lead this company. Those are legitimate questions, and I don't intend to dismiss them. I'm asking for the chance to answer them." She looked back at Arthur Wren. "Upstairs, in front of everyone." A pause. Arthur Wren studied her with the careful, undeceived attention of someone who has spent 75 years reading people in rooms and stopped being fooled a long time ago. "Your grandfather," he said, "had a habit of walking into rooms he wasn't invited into and making them his." "I know," Emily said. Something shifted in Arthur Wren's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a crack in the opposition. A hairline fracture in the wall he had built around his preferred outcome. "We'll see you upstairs," he said. Emily nodded. She turned and walked back out into the corridor. Margaret Chu fell into step beside her. "That was either very smart or very bold," Margaret said quietly. "My grandfather would say those are the same thing," Emily said. The boardroom on the 38th floor was the kind of room designed to convey authority. The table was long enough to seat 14 comfortably, and all 11 board members were already present when Emily and Margaret entered. Some were talking, some were reviewing documents. All of them looked up when the door opened. Emily walked to the head of the table. She did not hesitate. She did not look around the room to read the faces before she committed. She walked directly to the head of the table and set down the single legal pad she had brought with her, and she looked at the room. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Emily Sinclair. I'm the controlling owner of Sinclair International effective as of yesterday morning." She paused. "I want to start by telling you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to give you a presentation with slides and projections and a 5-year vision that I wrote in 6 days with the help of people who know this company better than I do. You would see through that immediately, and you'd be right to." Several faces around the table shifted slightly. A woman at the far end, Patricia Gale Emily recognized her from the board minutes, tilted her head just barely. "What I am going to do," Emily said, "is tell you the truth. I've been reading your reports and your meeting minutes for 6 days. I have questions, I have concerns. I have some instincts that may or may not be right. And I believe that the best thing I can do for this company right now is be honest about what I know and what I don't know, and then listen. She sat down. So, she said, let's start with the Vertex portfolio, because the Q3 numbers don't match the thesis and I want to understand why. Margaret Chu, seated to Emily's right, was perfectly still. Arthur Wren, who had entered the room behind Emily and taken his advisory seat at the far end of the table, was watching her with an expression that was no longer assessing. That had shifted into something Emily couldn't fully read from across the table. She noted it and moved on. Lawrence Holt leaned forward. You've read the Vertex thesis. I've read it twice, Emily said. The original and the Q2 amendment. The amendment softened the performance benchmarks without explaining why the original benchmarks were revised. That's the part I want to understand. A beat of silence. Then Patricia Gale said from the far end of the table, the Vertex situation is complicated. I assumed it was, Emily said. Complicated things usually are. Walk me through it. Patricia Gale looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the folder in front of her and began to talk. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was not easy. There were hard questions, several of them directed at Emily, testing the limits of her 6 days of preparation. She answered what she knew. She said, I don't know yet 3 times, and each time she said it, she followed it with a specific question that demonstrated she understood exactly what she didn't know and why it mattered. An hour in, Arthur Wren asked her directly, what is your long-term vision for the capital allocation strategy? The room went quiet. This was the question, the one that separated the prepared answer from the real one. Emily looked at him. I want to hear yours first, she said. You've been watching this company's capital strategy for 50 years. I've been watching it for 6 days. Tell me what you see. Arthur Wren looked at her for a long time. Then he began to talk. And Emily listened. She listened the way she had always listened, completely without performing it, without preparing her response while he was still speaking. She just listened. When he finished, she said, You think the venture arm is overextended? I think, Arthur said carefully, that Charles took some risks in the last 2 years that he might not have taken 10 years ago. Because he was dying, Emily said. He knew he was dying, and he wanted to build the company into something specific before he left it. Silence. Yes, Arthur said. That's what I think. Then we agree, Emily said. The question is how to consolidate without losing the 3 positions that actually have long-term potential. Which ones do you think those are? Arthur Wren named 2. Emily named a third. They spent 20 minutes discussing the third. By the end of the 2 hours and 40 minutes, no vote had been called. No formal ratification of Emily's position had been put to the table. It hadn't needed to be. The will was the will. The controlling interest was hers. What had happened in that room was something different, something more difficult and more valuable than a vote. It was the beginning of a working relationship, not a perfect one. Not yet. There were board members who left the room still cautious, still watching. Patricia Gale was one of them. She shook Emily's hand at the end with precise cordiality and said she looked forward to the next meeting, which was both true and a message. But Arthur Wren waited until the room had mostly cleared. He came to the head of the table where Emily was gathering her legal pad, and he stood beside her and he said, Your grandfather told me about you, years ago, when you married. He paused. He said he was afraid you had chosen a life that would make you small. I told him that wasn't possible. He paused again. Turns out we were both right. Emily looked at him. I opposed your inheritance, he said, directly and through channels. I want you to know that because I think you should know who in this room was honest and who wasn't. I know, Emily said. Daniel told me. He absorbed that, nodded once the way men of a certain generation nod when they have been caught being straightforward and find they don't mind. The Forsyth candidate, he said, the man on the 17th floor. What about him? He went home an hour ago, Arthur Wren said. I called him during the break. Emily held her legal pad against her chest and looked at Arthur Wren, this man who had known her grandfather since before she was born, who had watched this company grow from a handshake deal into a $4 billion institution, who had opposed her with every tool at his disposal, and was now standing beside her, telling her about it directly. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Don't thank me yet, he said. We have a great deal of work to do. I know, Emily said. I'm not afraid of work. He almost smiled. The almost was enough. He left. Emily stood alone at the head of the Sinclair International boardroom table and looked out the window at the gray November sky over Manhattan. Somewhere across the city, in a building with lawyers and filing deadlines and the slow machinery of a criminal investigation, Richard Whitmore was learning what it cost to underestimate someone. And in this room, in this building, at this table, Emily Sinclair was learning something else entirely. Something her grandfather had tried to tell her 20 years ago, and that she had needed 11 years of the wrong life to finally understand. Power is not something that is given to you. It is not something you inherit in a document on a judge's bench or a letter in a cream-colored envelope. It is something you walk into a room and claim in front of people who weren't sure you deserved it, with nothing but the truth of what you know and the honesty to say what you don't. She had walked in this morning as Charles Sinclair's granddaughter. She was walking out as something more specific and more permanent and entirely her own. She was the woman at the head of this table, and she was just getting started. The first 3 months were the hardest. Not because of the board, not because of the portfolio complexity or the operational learning curve or the sheer volume of decisions that landed on Emily's desk every single day from the moment she formally assumed the role of controlling owner and acting CEO of Sinclair International. Those things were hard in the way that any genuinely demanding work is hard, the kind of hard that exhausts you cleanly and lets you sleep. The difficult part was something else entirely. It was the phone calls. They started in the second week. Not from Richard directly. His lawyers had made clear that direct contact was inadvisable given the ongoing DA inquiry, but from people who knew Richard. Former colleagues, mutual acquaintances from the Riverside Drive years. People Emily hadn't spoken to in months, some of them in years, who suddenly found reasons to reach out. The calls had a pattern. They began with warmth. "How are you, Emily? It's been so long. I heard about everything. I just wanted to check in." Then they circled gradually toward Richard. "He's struggling," they said. "He's not doing well. You know he's not a bad person, not really. Surely there's something you could do. Surely you could speak to whoever it is at the DA's office. Surely after 11 years there's some compassion left." She listened to each call fully. She did not interrupt. When the caller arrived at the real point, she said calmly and without heat, "I'm not going to interfere with the investigation, but I appreciate you calling." Then she ended the conversation. She told Clara about the calls one evening over dinner at Clara's apartment, pasta, a bottle of red wine, the ordinary rhythms of a friendship being rebuilt after years of forced distance. "How many?" Clara asked. 11 calls in 2 weeks, Emily said, "and 2 emails." Clara set down her fork. "Who are these people?" "People who were always more Richard's friends than mine," Emily said. "I just didn't see it clearly until now." "And how do you feel when you hang up?" Emily thought about it. "Sad," she said. "Not angry, sad. Because some of those people, a few of them, I think they genuinely believe what they're saying. They genuinely believe they're helping him. And they have no idea that what they're actually doing is confirming everything I already knew about why I had to leave." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're handling this better than I would." "I'm handling it better than I was," Emily said. "There's a difference." The DA's inquiry became a formal investigation in the 6th week. Victoria Hayes called Emily on a Tuesday morning with the news delivered in her characteristic way, direct, unadorned, with all the relevant facts front-loaded. "They've opened a formal financial crimes investigation," Victoria said. "The scope is broader than the bakery accounts. They've found additional transfers not connected to Sweet Sinclair. There are accounts in Richard's corporate structure that appear to have been used to move money from at least 2 other sources. One of them is a former business partner of his from about 6 years ago, a man named Caldwell." Emily set down her coffee. "I don't know a Caldwell." "You wouldn't. This predates your involvement in his finances. But the DA is now looking at a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. The Sweet Sinclair transfers are part of a larger picture." Victoria paused. "Emily, this has become a significant case. Richard is facing potential exposure on multiple fronts. His legal costs alone at this point must be extraordinary." "Is he going to try to deal?" Emily asked. "Harrison already has. The DA is not interested in a deal that doesn't include full restitution and a guilty plea on at least the core charges." "Good," Emily said. Then after a pause, "Is there anything you need from me?" I'll need you available for a formal interview with the investigators, probably within the next 2 weeks. It'll be long, 4, maybe 5 hours. I'll be with you the entire time. Schedule it, Emily said. She hung up and sat for a moment at her desk on the 38th floor. Her desk now, Charles Sinclair's desk, a massive piece of furniture in dark walnut that she had kept because getting rid of it felt wrong, like erasing a signature. She had rearranged it completely, cleared the surface of his accumulations, and replaced them with her own legal pads, a coffee thermos, 2 framed photos, a small notebook where she wrote things she wanted to remember. One of the framed photos was her mother. The other was a picture Clara had taken at the bar on West 4th Street the night of the divorce, Emily mid-laugh, wine glass in hand, looking like someone who had just remembered something important. She looked at that photo now. She thought about Richard. She tried to do what she had trained herself to do over the past weeks, not to imagine his day, not to map his suffering, not to feel responsible for consequences she had not caused. He had made choices. Every single choice in the chain that led to where he was now had been his. She had simply stopped pretending the choices weren't happening. She picked up the phone. She called Margaret Chu. "Walk me through the Vertex situation again," she said. "I want to look at the Q4 projections before the board meeting Friday." And she went back to work. The board meeting that Friday was the 4th since Emily had assumed control, and it was different from the first 3, in a way she could feel as soon as she walked into the room. The earlier meetings had carried the particular tension of a group of people who were still deciding whether to trust her. That tension had not fully resolved. Patricia Gale still watched her with the careful attention of someone reserving judgment, but it had shifted. It had become more like the productive friction of a team still learning each other, rather than the guarded silence of adversaries sharing a table. Arthur Wren arrived 10 minutes early, which Emily had come to understand was his way of signaling engagement. When Arthur Wren showed up early, he had things to say. She poured him coffee from the carafe on the side table and handed it to him, and he accepted it with the brief nod of a man who is old enough to understand that small gestures matter. "I heard from Daniel Morgan this week," he said quietly before the others arrived. Emily looked at him. "About what?" "The Caldwell situation, the additional accounts the DA found." He looked at his coffee. "I knew Caldwell, peripherally. He invested in a project that was adjacent to something we were looking at about 6 years ago. I never trusted Richard Whitmore even then, and I told your grandfather so." Emily was very still. "What did my grandfather say?" "He said you were happy." Arthur set his coffee down. "He said you seemed happy, and he didn't want to be the reason you weren't." He paused. "He was wrong to stay silent. I told him that too." "Did he agree?" "Eventually." Arthur looked at her directly. He spent the last 2 years of his life making it right, in the only way he knew how. Emily held that for a moment. The letter, the trust structure, the condition. Her grandfather in his 80s rewriting his will and designing a legal mechanism to protect her from a man he had watched for years and never trusted. Doing it in secret. Doing it in the only language he had ever been fluent in. "He should have just called me," Emily said. "Yes," Arthur said. "He should have, but he was afraid you'd say no." The other board members filed in. Emily moved to the head of the table. She opened her legal pad. The meeting began. 2 hours into the meeting, Emily put forward a proposal she had been developing for 3 weeks. "I want to restructure the venture arm," she said. "Not eliminate it, restructure. Consolidate from 11 active positions to 5. The 5 with the strongest long-term fundamentals. The others we negotiate exits over the next 18 months systematically without signaling distress to the market." Lawrence Holt leaned forward. "Which 5? Emily named them. She had the supporting data ready. Margaret had helped her build the analysis, and she walked the board through it methodically. Not with slides, with numbers on paper explained in plain language that didn't hide anything behind the vocabulary of financial performance marketing. Patricia Gale asked 3 hard questions. Emily answered 2 directly and said, "That's a legitimate concern, and I don't have a complete answer yet," on the 3rd, which was about potential tax exposure in one of the exit scenarios. "I'm meeting with the tax team next Monday," Emily said. "I'll have a complete answer before we vote." "When are you proposing to vote?" Patricia asked. "Next board meeting, 3 weeks." Emily looked at her. "I'm not asking anyone to move faster than the analysis supports." Patricia Gale held her gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something on her notepad. It was not a yes, but it was not a no, and from Patricia Gale. Emily was learning the distance between those two things was navigable. The meeting ended at 1 in the afternoon. As the board members gathered their things, Arthur Wren stopped beside Emily's chair. "That was well done," he said, simply without elaboration, the way someone says something when they mean it exactly as stated. "Thank you," Emily said. He left. She sat alone for a moment, gathering her own papers, and allowed herself one small, private acknowledgement of what had just happened. 3 months ago, she had been sitting in a courthouse cafeteria with cold coffee and no idea that the phone call she was about to receive would change the entire architecture of her life. And now she was here, at this table, making decisions that would affect 612 people across 3 offices and a portfolio of assets worth $4 billion. She was not the same person who had walked into courtroom 4B in a simple black dress. Or rather, she was exactly that person. She had just stopped apologizing for her. The formal interview with the DA's investigators happened on a Wednesday morning in early December in a conference room at the district attorney's office that had the impersonal functionality of a room designed for exactly this purpose. Emily arrived with Victoria Hayes and spent 4 hours and 22 minutes answering questions about the Sweet Sinclair accounts, her knowledge of Whitmore Holdings LLC, the timeline of the transfers, and the nature of her access to the marital finances. She told the truth, all of it, without embellishment and without minimization. The lead investigator was a woman named Ruiz, compact and precise in the way that Emily was coming to associate with people who were genuinely good at their jobs. She asked her questions without apparent judgment, circled back when she needed clarification, and took notes with a focus that suggested she was not missing anything. At the 3-hour mark, after a brief break, Ruiz set down her pen and said, "Ms. Sinclair, I want to ask you something outside the formal scope of the interview. You don't have to answer." Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly but didn't intervene. "Go ahead," Emily said. "Did you know, at any point during the marriage, did you suspect what was happening to the business accounts?" Emily thought about it honestly. She owed the question that much. "There were moments," she said slowly, "when the numbers didn't add up the way I expected. And I noticed. I would ask Gerald Fitch about specific line items, and he would explain them not always convincingly, but plausibly enough that I let it go. I think—" She paused. "I think I was also being told consistently and repeatedly by my husband that I wasn't good with numbers, that finance wasn't my strength, that I should focus on the creative side of the business and leave the accounting to people who understood it." She looked at her hands. "I believed him. For a long time I believed him. And that belief cost me $243,000 and 2 years of thinking my business failed because I wasn't capable." Ruiz was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That's helpful." Emily looked up. "Is it enough to build the case?" "We have enough," Ruiz said. "What you just told me explains the mechanism, how he maintained access without triggering suspicion. That fills a gap." She paused. "Ms. Sinclair, I've been doing this for 14 years. Financial abuse in the context of a marriage is one of the most difficult things to prove because it relies on a victim's trust being weaponized against them. The perpetrator always has an explanation, always has an accomplice who can corroborate. You're not the first woman who sat in that chair and told me she let things go because someone she trusted told her she wasn't capable of understanding them." Emily absorbed that. "How many?" she asked. "More than I should be comfortable saying," Ruiz said. "But today, you're the one sitting here, and that matters." Emily drove back to the office. She sat in the back of the car and looked out the window at the December city, the early dark, the lights coming on in the buildings, people moving on the sidewalks in their coats and scarves with somewhere to be and something to carry. She thought about what Ruiz had said, "More than I should be comfortable saying." There had been a moment in the first months after leaving Richard when Emily had convinced herself that her situation was anomalous, a private disaster, a particular combination of her own naivety and his particular cruelty. She had been reluctant to discuss it publicly, reluctant even to name it the way Clara kept gently suggesting she name it, because naming it meant it was real, and real things have weight, and she was already carrying as much as she could manage. But sitting in the back of that car watching the city move past the window, she thought about the word Ruiz had used. Mechanism. How the mechanism worked. How it required a specific kind of sustained effort, not just the theft, but the groundwork for the theft. The years of methodical erosion of someone's confidence in her own perception, her own competence, her own right to ask questions about her own life. It wasn't personal. That was the thing. It wasn't about her specifically. It was about what she represented: access resources, a life he wanted to live without building it himself. She had simply been the most convenient architecture for that. Understanding that didn't make it stop hurting, but it changed the quality of the hurt. It moved it from something intimate and shameful into something she could look at directly without flinching. She was still looking at it when her phone rang. Victoria. "Harrison called me 20 minutes ago," Victoria said. "Richard wants to talk, not through lawyers, directly." Emily's hand tightened on the phone. "He wants to talk to me directly. He's asking for a meeting, no lawyers present. He says he has something to tell you that isn't in any document the DA has seen." The car moved through traffic. Emily watched a woman on the sidewalk wrestling with an umbrella that had turned inside out in the wind, laughing at herself despite the rain. "He's going to try to negotiate," Emily said. "Almost certainly," Victoria said. "The question is whether there's information he has that the DA needs and that he might trade for your agreement to— I don't know exactly. That's what he wants to tell you." "What do you think I should do?" Victoria paused. She didn't answer immediately, which was unusual. "Honestly, I think you should hear what he has to say, with me present. Not without a lawyer. I don't care what he asked for. But I think there may be information in whatever he's planning to tell you that matters. Not for the investigation necessarily, for you." Emily thought about that. "Set it up," she said. "But I choose the location, and you're in the room." 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon, Emily sat across a table from Richard Whitmore for the first time since the courtroom. He looked different. Not dramatically, it had only been a few months, but something about him had deflated. The particular inflation of a man who moves through the world, certain of his own position, certain that he is winning the game that matters, that was gone. What was left was something more ordinary, something closer to human scale. He sat down across from her and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Victoria was at the end of the table, folder open, pen uncapped. Harrison was not present. Richard had come alone, which surprised Emily, and she could tell from Victoria's brief expression, surprised Victoria too. "You look well," Richard said. "Richard," Emily said, "what did you want to tell me?" He put both hands flat on the table. An old gesture, she recognized it from the boardroom manner he used to practice at home, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, rehearsing the physicality of authority. "The Caldwell transfers," he said, "the ones the DA found." Emily waited. "Caldwell knew," Richard said. "He wasn't a victim. He and I structured those accounts together. He's been cooperating with the DA and telling them I acted unilaterally, but that's not true. He has his own exposure and he's burying it by making me the only target." Emily looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the DA needs to know, and they'll listen to you." He paused. You have credibility with them. After your testimony, Ruiz told Harrison that your testimony was significant. And you want me to tell the DA that Caldwell is lying. I want you to tell them to look more carefully at his records, because if they do, they'll find the same pattern on his side that they found in mine, and then the picture changes." "The picture changes," Emily said, "meaning the charges against you change. Meaning they get split more accurately between two people who were both responsible." Victoria wrote something on her notepad. Emily didn't look at it. She looked at Richard. This was the most honest she had ever seen him. Not because honesty was his instinct, she knew well enough by now that it wasn't, but because he had exhausted every other option, and honesty was what was left. It was the last play, and he was making it with the specific desperation of a man who understands that the game is nearly over. "Richard," she said, "if what you're telling me about Caldwell is true, the investigators will find it. They're good at what they do. You don't need me to tell them to look. You need to tell your lawyers to give them the specific records that show Caldwell's involvement, and then the investigators will do their job." He stared at her. "That's it. That's all you're going to say. What did you expect me to say?" "I expected—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "I don't know what I expected." He looked at his hands. "I expected you to be angrier, or I don't know, something." "I was angry," Emily said. "For a long time I was very angry, but anger is expensive, and I've started being more careful about what I spend." A silence. "The foundation," Richard said. The word came out differently, quieter. "I read about it. in the financial press. She hadn't expected that. 2 weeks earlier, Emily had announced the Sinclair Foundation, a philanthropic initiative funded from her personal inheritance, separate from Sinclair International, with a specific mandate: financial education, legal support and recovery resources for people, primarily women, who had experienced financial abuse within intimate relationships. The announcement had been covered in 3 publications, which was 3 more than Emily had anticipated. "It's in early stages," Emily said. "The name," Richard said. "You didn't call it the Carter Foundation or the Sinclair Foundation. You called it the Sweet Sinclair Foundation." Emily looked at him. "Yes." "After the bakery." "After what the bakery represented," she said, "before everything that happened to it." Richard was very still. "That was the name I laughed at," he said. "In the beginning, when you told me you were going to name the bakery Sweet Sinclair, I told you it was a ridiculous name for a serious business." "I remember," Emily said. "And you named the foundation after it anyway." "Yes," she said. He absorbed that. He sat with it. Emily watched something in his face, do something she hadn't seen before. Not the panic from the courtroom, not the calculation from the marriage years, but something rawer, something that looked almost like remorse. Almost. She had learned over the years, and especially over the last months, not to overinterpret almost. Almost remorse is not remorse. Almost sorry is not sorry. She would not do him the disservice of believing what she wanted to believe instead of what she could actually see. "Is there anything else?" she asked. He shook his head. She stood up. Victoria began gathering her papers. "Emily," Richard said. She stopped. Didn't sit back down, but stopped. "The laugh," he said. "In the courtroom, when I looked at you and I that." He couldn't quite finish the sentence. "I've thought about that every day." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "Good," she said. Not cruelly, but clearly. "Maybe that's the beginning of something." She walked out. Victoria fell into step beside her in the corridor. Neither of them spoke until they were in the elevator. Then Victoria said, "The Caldwell information. He's probably right about it." "I think so too," Emily said. "Can you flag it to Ruiz not as coming from Richard, just as something worth looking at more carefully?" "Already planning to," Victoria said. The elevator doors opened. They walked through the lobby and out onto the street. The December air hit them both. Emily stopped on the sidewalk and turned her face up for a moment, the cold on her skin, the wide gray sky, the noise of the city going on without pausing for anyone. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. Victoria waited. "The morning of the divorce hearing," Emily said. "I stood at my front door with that old handbag, and I thought about everything I didn't have, the empty account, the failed business, the tiny apartment." She paused. "And I walked out anyway. I didn't know about the inheritance yet. I didn't know about any of this. I walked out anyway." "Yes," Victoria said. "That's the part I want to remember," Emily said. "Not the inheritance, not the company. That morning, when I had nothing by any measurable standard, and I walked out anyway." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have nothing," she said. "You had exactly what you needed. You just didn't have a name for it yet." Emily looked at her. "What would you call it?" Victoria considered. "I would call it the thing that brought you to my table." Emily smiled. "The real kind, the kind that starts in the chest." A taxi stopped at the curb. Victoria got in. Emily waved her off and stood on the sidewalk for another minute. Her phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Shoeboard Materials for Monday, ready when you are. Also, Patricia Gale called me this afternoon. She has a question about the foundation. She wants to know if you'd consider a board seat for it. Emily read the message twice. Patricia Gale, who had watched her from across the boardroom table with the careful reserve of someone holding their verdict. Patricia Gale, who had asked the hardest questions and accepted the honest answers. Patricia Gale, who had apparently decided that the Sweet Sinclair Foundation was something worth being part of. Emily typed back, "Tell her yes, let's set a meeting." She put her phone in her pocket. She started walking. The city moved around her. The early dark of December, the storefronts lit up the smell of someone's food cart on the corner, the sound of a group of people laughing somewhere behind her over something she would never know the context of. Ordinary life. Relentless, indifferent, magnificent, ordinary life. She had a board meeting on Monday. She had a foundation in its infancy. She had a company of 612 people whose livelihoods were connected in some real way to the quality of her decisions. She had a DA investigation moving toward its resolution. She had a friendship being rebuilt one dinner at a time. She had a desk in a walnut office on the 38th floor, and a letter in a cream-colored envelope in the top drawer of that desk, and a photograph on the desk surface of herself. Laughing, taken the night everything finally ended and everything else finally began. She was coming to understand a great deal. She walked through the December city with her hands in her pockets and her face into the cold, and she thought about none of it specifically, and all of it at once. The weight of it was not heavy. It was the weight of things that are real, the satisfying density of a life that is actually being lived rather than endured. 3 months ago, she had walked out of a courtroom in a simple black dress. She was still the same woman. She always had been. That was the whole point. And somewhere in the city, in the ordinary overlap of 10,000 private stories happening simultaneously, Richard Whitmore was sitting with the consequences of the morning. He had laughed at her, and Gerald Fitch was cooperating with investigators, and Arthur Wren was reading quarterly reports in his apartment on the Upper East Side, and Clara was probably already texting to make plans for the weekend, and Margaret Chu was sending board materials from wherever Margaret Chu went when she left the office, which Emily had come to suspect was simply a different office. And Emily Sinclair walked on, past the food cart, past the lit-up storefronts, past the group of people laughing at something she would never know, into the December dark, into whatever came next. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late February, 14 weeks after the divorce was finalized, 11 weeks after Emily had sat across from Richard in that conference room and watched him run out of moves. She was at her desk on the 38th floor, working through the restructuring documents for the venture arm consolidation, when Victoria's name appeared on her phone screen. She answered on the first ring. "They filed," Victoria said. Emily set down her pen. "When?" "This morning, 9:15. Richard Whitmore has been formally charged with financial fraud, wire fraud, and 2 counts of theft by deception." The Caldwell angle played out exactly the way Richard said it would. Investigators found parallel activity in Caldwell's records, and he's been charged separately. The DA declined to treat either man as the sole target. "So Richard was telling the truth," Emily said, "about Caldwell." "I was telling the truth about that part, yes." Victoria paused. "The arraignment is Thursday. It'll be public. There will likely be press coverage." Emily absorbed that. Press coverage. The word public doing the thing it always does, expanding outward, past the edges of the private story she had been living for months into the open air where anyone could see it. "How much coverage?" she said. "Enough," Victoria said. "Richard Whitmore isn't a household name, but Sinclair International is. And once reporters connect the dots between the fraud charges and the divorce and the inheritance, Emily, it's going to be a story. I want you prepared for that." "What kind of prepared?" "The foundation," Victoria said. "The Sweet Sinclair Foundation. It's going to get attention in the context of this story. People are going to want to talk to you. You don't have to say yes to any of it. But you should decide in advance how you want to handle it, because the decision will be made one way or another by you or by the narrative that forms without you." Emily looked at the photograph on her desk, the one Clara had taken at the bar on West 4th Street, herself laughing wineglass in hand the night everything ended. "I'll think about it," she said. "Let me think about it today and call you tonight." She hung up. She sat for a long moment without moving. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the restructuring documents, because the work did not stop for anyone's private reckoning. And she had a board vote in 6 days, and Patricia Gale was still watching, and the Vertex position still needed to be resolved before the market moved. She thought about what Victoria had said while she worked. She thought about it the way she thought about complex problems, not directly, not with focused attention, but sideways, letting it sit at the edge of her awareness while her hands did something else. By noon, she had made her decision. She called Margaret Chu first. "The charges against Richard will be public Thursday," Emily said. "There's going to be press. Some of it will touch the foundation. I want to be proactive about it, not reactive. Can you get me Lisa Tran?" Lisa Tran was the communications director Margaret had brought in 6 weeks ago, a woman in her early 40s who had spent 15 years managing corporate communications for companies in crisis, and had, in Emily's assessment, the rare quality of genuinely understanding the difference between a story that needed to be controlled and a story that needed to be told. "She's in the building," Margaret said. "I'll send her up." Lisa arrived 20 minutes later. She sat across from Emily and listened without interrupting while Emily told her what was coming. When Emily finished, Lisa was quiet for a moment, making notes. "Okay," Lisa said. "Here's what I think. The story is going to be framed one of two ways depending on who tells it first. Version 1. Wealthy heiress's estranged husband faces fraud charges in scandalous divorce fallout. Version 2. Founder of Financial Abuse Support Foundation speaks out about the experience that inspired her work." She looked up. Version 2 is the true story. It's also the more powerful story. And if you tell it in your own words on your own terms, before the arraignment coverage defines the frame, you control it. You don't let it control you. Emily looked at her. "You're suggesting I give an interview?" "I'm suggesting you tell the truth," Lisa said, "which you've been doing all along. This is just telling it to more people." Emily thought about Ruiz, more than I should be comfortable saying, about all the women who had sat in that chair across from the investigator and described the same mechanism, the same slow erosion, the same weaponized trust, the same quiet theft conducted in the language of love. "One interview," Emily said. "I choose the outlet. I set the terms, no questions about Richard's legal proceedings specifically. The story is about the foundation. The rest is context." "Agreed," Lisa said. She was already reaching for her phone. The interview ran the following Monday, 3 days before the board vote on the venture arm restructuring, and 2 days after Richard's arraignment had generated exactly the kind of coverage Victoria had predicted. Accurate, not sensational, but connecting the dots in ways that made the private story public in the particular irreversible way that published things become public. The piece ran in a business publication that Emily respected, written by a journalist named Kate Sorensen, who had covered financial crimes for 12 years, and approached the interview with the specific quality that Emily had come to associate with people who were good at their work. Complete attention, no agenda, she could detect, and questions that were harder than they appeared on the surface. The piece focused on the foundation. It described its mandate: financial education, legal resources, recovery support for people experiencing financial abuse in intimate relationships. It described Emily's own experience in terms that Emily had chosen carefully and reviewed with Victoria before the interview, specific enough to be real, restrained enough to be dignified. It included the number the DA's office had provided the total of documented financial abuse cases reported in New York State alone in the previous year. The number was large enough that Kate Sorensen had paused when she read it aloud and said, "I knew it was significant. I didn't know it was that significant." "Most people don't," Emily had said. "That's part of the problem." The piece ran on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Emily's office phone had received 47 calls. By Tuesday, the Sweet Sinclair Foundation's website, which James Park had built quietly over the previous month, functional but not yet formally launched, had received over 12,000 visitors. By Wednesday morning, 3 of those visitors had sent emails through the foundation's contact form that Margaret printed and brought to Emily's desk personally, without explanation, simply placing them in front of her and stepping back. Emily read them. The first was from a woman in Ohio named Sandra, who was 53 years old and had spent the last 2 years trying to understand why her small business had failed when she had worked so hard, and who had, just after reading the piece, opened her own financial records for the first time with new eyes and found something that hadn't made sense before and now suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. The second was from a woman in Texas named Maria, who was 61 and had been divorced for 4 years and was still paying off debts that she had always believed were her fault, her failures, and who wanted to know if the foundation could help her find someone to look at the documents she'd been too ashamed to show anyone. The third was from a woman in Seattle named Joyce, who was 49 and simply wrote, "I thought I was the only one. I have been so ashamed. Thank you for saying it out loud." Emily read all 3 emails twice. She sat with them the way she had sat with her grandfather's letter, not rushing past, letting them be real. Then she called Margaret back in. "I want to respond to each of these personally," she said. "Today." Margaret looked at her. "Emily, if the volume keeps building—" "I know," Emily said. "We'll build the infrastructure to handle the volume, but these 3 today, I respond personally." She paused. "These are the people the foundation exists for, not as a category, as individuals, Sandra and Maria and Joyce." She looked at the printed emails. They took something significant to write those emails. The least I can do is write back. Margaret nodded. She left. Emily wrote 3 emails that afternoon. She did not use a template. She wrote each one specifically responding to what each woman had actually said, and she included the Foundation's direct legal intake line at the bottom of each a number connected to a team of pro bono attorneys. Victoria had helped Emily recruit over the past 6 weeks. She sent them at 4 in the afternoon. Sandra replied within the hour. 2 words, "Thank you." Emily stared at those 2 words on her screen for a long time. The board vote on Thursday went the way Emily had believed it would go, not easily because nothing in that room happened easily, but clearly. The venture arm restructuring passed 8-3. The 3 dissenting votes came from board members who had concerns about the timeline rather than the strategy itself, and Emily noted that distinction carefully because it mattered. Opposition based on timeline was workable. Opposition based on strategy was a different conversation. Patricia Gale voted yes. Emily registered that without visible reaction, but she registered it fully. After the vote, as the room was clearing, Patricia came to the head of the table. "The Foundation," she said. "I read the piece in full, and I read it again." Emily waited. "My daughter," Patricia said, and then stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly, composed herself with the practiced control of a woman who has spent decades in professional rooms and learned exactly how much of herself to show and how much to hold back. "My daughter went through something similar 7 years ago. She's fine now, she's built a good life. But at the time, I didn't understand what was happening to her. I didn't have the vocabulary for it." She paused. "That piece gave me vocabulary I wish I'd had 7 years ago." Emily looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your daughter." "She's all right," Patricia said, again with the precise control. "She's better than all right. But I wanted you to know the Foundation matters. Not as a corporate initiative. It matters." Emily said, "Would you be willing to speak with her about joining the Foundation board?" "She doesn't have to share her personal story publicly. The board needs people who understand the issue from the inside." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression shifted the final movement of something that had been slowly rotating toward a different position for weeks. "Have Daniel Morgan call her," Patricia said. "Her name is Rachel." "I will," Emily said. Patricia gathered her folder and left. Emily stood at the head of the table alone for a moment, the way she had been doing after board meetings since the first one, taking the one quiet minute before the day continued moving. She thought about Rachel, about Sandra and Maria and Joyce, about the 47 phone calls and 12,000 website visitors and the number the DA's office had cited that had made Kate Sorensen pause. She had built a company. She was learning to run it imperfectly with the honest acknowledgement of what she didn't yet know, but with the specific quality her grandfather had described in his letter, the quality she had always had, the quality she had spent 11 years being told she lacked. But this, the Foundation, the emails Patricia Gale telling her about Rachel, this was something else. Something that didn't fit inside a quarterly report or a board resolution. This was the part that was actually about her grandfather's real lesson. He had written it in the letter. She had been turning it over ever since. Money was never the true inheritance. That was what everyone who would eventually write about her story would quote, because it was the kind of sentence that sounds like a conclusion. But Emily knew it wasn't the conclusion. It was the beginning of one. The true inheritance was not even the belief in herself exactly. It was something more specific. It was the understanding that the things she had lived through, the erosion, the loss, the quiet daily diminishment of who she was, were not private failures. They were not the particular shame of one woman who had made bad choices in one marriage in one city. They were a mechanism, a recognizable, documentable, preventable mechanism. And understanding a mechanism means you can disrupt it. That was what the Foundation was, a disruption. She was still thinking about this when her phone rang, an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. She answered. "Ms. Sinclair," a woman's voice hesitant. Young, she thought, maybe late 20s. "I'm sorry to call directly. I got this number from, I'm not sure I should say how I got it. I'm sorry." "It's all right," Emily said. "What's your name?" "Diane," the woman said. "I read the article. About your Foundation." A pause. I'm still in it. The situation. I haven't left yet. And I read the article and I didn't know there was somewhere to call." Emily sat down. "Diane," she said, You called the right place. She spent 40 minutes on the phone with Diane. She did not give her advice because she was not a counselor, and she knew the difference between what she was equipped to offer and what Diane actually needed. What she gave her was the legal intake number and the name of a counselor on the Foundation's referral list who specialized in exactly this situation, and she stayed on the phone until Diane had written both down twice and said she would call. "Will you?" Emily said. "Today." A pause. "Yes," Diane said. "I will." "Okay," Emily said. "And Diane, you called. That took something. Don't forget that you did that." She hung up. She sat at her desk on the 38th floor and let the silence of the room hold her for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and called Margaret. "I want to talk about the Foundation's intake capacity," she said. "We need more infrastructure, more counselors on retainer, more legal intake staff, a proper phone line with trained responders. What would it cost to triple what we currently have?" "I'll have numbers for you by end of day," Margaret said. "Thank you," Emily said. She hung up. She looked at the photograph on her desk. Herself laughing at the bar on West 4th Street the night everything ended. She looked different now. Not in the photograph was 4 months old, but she was different. She could feel it in the specific way you feel a change that has happened gradually and then becomes suddenly visible, like the way you don't notice a plant growing, until one day you look at it and understand it has doubled in size while you weren't paying direct attention. She was not harder. That was the thing people sometimes assumed about women who had been through what she had been through and come out the other side with their hands on something significant. They assumed the experience had calcified something, built walls, made the person armored in a way that kept things out as efficiently as it kept things in. That was not what had happened to Emily. She was, if anything, more permeable than she had been, more willing to be reached. Diane's voice on the phone had gotten all the way through, all the way past the professional surface and the institutional role and the $4 billion company and the board votes and the restructuring documents, and it had landed somewhere real, somewhere that still felt things cleanly and specifically, and without the mediation of self-protection. She thought that was probably important. She thought that was probably the thing worth protecting most carefully. Not the portfolio, not the board relationships, not even the Foundation's operating capacity, but that. The ability to be reached. To pick up an unknown number and stay on the line for 40 minutes because a woman named Diane needed 40 minutes and Emily had them to give. In March, 6 weeks after the charges were filed, Richard Whitmore entered a guilty plea on 2 of the 4 counts. The wire fraud charges were reduced as part of a negotiated agreement. He received a suspended sentence, mandatory restitution, and 3 years of supervised release. The restitution amount included the full $243,000 from the Sweet Sinclair accounts, plus additional amounts tied to the Caldwell situation. Victoria called Emily with the news. "How do you feel?" Victoria asked. Emily thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about things without rushing past the real answer to find the comfortable one. "Relieved," she said. "Not for me specifically, for the process, that it worked the way it was supposed to work." "And for yourself," Victoria pressed. "I feel—" Emily paused. "I feel like it's been over for a long time. The legal part being finished just means the paperwork matches the reality." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "You know, when Daniel Morgan first called me about this case, about representing you, I almost said no. My practice doesn't typically take on family law matters." Emily hadn't known that. "Why did you say yes?" "Because Daniel told me who your grandfather was," Victoria said. "And then he told me who you were. And he said, I'm quoting him exactly because I wrote it down. He said, she's going to need someone who can keep up with her." A pause. "I thought that was an interesting way to put it." Emily smiled. "Could you keep up?" "Mostly," Victoria said. "You move fast." "I had a lot of time to catch up on," Emily said. She went to the Foundation's first public event 3 weeks later. It was not a gala. It was not a fundraiser with tables and centerpieces and speeches from a podium. Emily had been explicit about that from the beginning. She had told Lisa Tran the event should feel like a resource, not a celebration. People should leave with something practical, information, connections, a number to call, a name to reach out to. The event was held in a rented community space in Midtown on a Saturday morning. 47 people attended. Legal advisors were available for one-on-one consultations. Financial counselors were there. Two therapists who had agreed to donate their time were available in private rooms for anyone who needed to talk. Emily was there the entire time. She did not stand at a podium. She moved through the room and talked to people sat across from them at folding tables and listened to them the way Clara had listened to her at the bar on West 4th Street, completely and without performing it. A woman named Ruth, who was 67 and had been out of her situation for 3 years, but was still untangling the financial wreckage, sat across from Emily and said, "I never told anyone the whole story. I told pieces of it, but never the whole thing." "What happens when you tell the whole thing?" Emily asked. Ruth thought about it. "It stops being something I did wrong," she said. "It becomes something that was done to me. Those are different things." "Yes," Emily said. "They are very different things." Ruth looked at her. "You understand that personally?" "Yes," Emily said. "I do." Ruth nodded slowly. She pressed her lips together in the way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is deciding carefully to set it down. "I spent 3 years thinking the shame was mine to carry," she said. "I'm tired of carrying it." "Then put it down," Emily said. "Right here. You don't have to take it with you when you leave." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, just that, just okay." The word of someone making a small, enormous decision. Emily sat with her for another 20 minutes, and when Ruth left, she shook Emily's hand and held it for just a second longer than a handshake requires, which was the whole conversation in compressed form, everything that hadn't been said out loud. Clara came to the event. She arrived late the way she always did, and slipped in through the side door and found Emily between conversations, and handed her a coffee without saying anything, because Clara had always understood that the right support is often just the right object at the right moment. "How is it going?" Clara asked. "Good," Emily said. "Really good." Clara looked around the room, at the conversations happening at folding tables, at the woman near the window who had started crying while talking to one of the counselors and was now a few minutes later laughing at something the counselor had said, at the 2 women near the door who had come in separately and discovered they lived 4 blocks apart and had been comparing notes with the urgent animation of people who have just found an unexpected witness to their own experience. "Your grandfather would have hated this event," Clara said. "Too much feeling, not enough marble." Emily laughed. "He would have funded it anyway," she said. "That was his way." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I said it." They stood together for a moment, drinking their coffee, watching the room do what Emily had built it to do. The year that followed was not simple. Running Sinclair International was not simple. The venture arm restructuring took longer than projected and generated the specific kind of board tension that comes from a timeline slipping. And Emily sat through 3 difficult meetings in a row where Lawrence Holt pushed back hard on the pace and Emily pushed back on Lawrence Holt, and they found eventually a middle position that neither of them loved and both of them could live with, which was often how things got done. Patricia Gale's daughter Rachel joined the foundation board in April. She came to her first meeting with a folder of research she had compiled on her own comparative analysis of financial abuse support programs in 6 other cities, and Emily looked at the folder and thought, "Yes, this is exactly right." Arthur Wren retired from his advisory role in June. He called Emily the morning before his last board meeting and said, "I want to tell you something before today." "Tell me," Emily said. "I have been in this company for 50 years, he said. "I watched Charles Sinclair build it from $40,000. I have watched it through 3 recessions, 2 market crashes, 1 scandal that nearly destroyed the real estate division in 2004, and the passing of the man who made it what it is." He paused. "In all of that time, I have never seen anyone walk into that boardroom and command it the way you did on that first Thursday. Not because you had all the answers, because you didn't pretend to." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Arthur," she said, "that first day, 22, when I walked into the room where you were talking to Lawrence and Susan." "Yes." "Were you planning to fight me the whole day?" A pause, the sound of him almost smiling. "Right up until you mentioned what your grandfather said about me. That you were always right when you told him he was wrong." "That's the one," Arthur said. "No one had told me that before, in 50 years. "It's true," Emily said. "I know," he said. "That's what made it effective." His last board meeting was in June, and when it ended and the room cleared, Arthur Wren shook Emily's hand, a firm, brief, definitive handshake, the kind that closes a chapter, and he said, "Don't let them make you into something smaller than you are." "I won't," Emily said. "I know," he said. That's why I'm comfortable leaving." He walked out. The door closed. Emily stood at the head of the table where she had stood for almost a year of Thursday mornings, and she understood that something had just passed. A particular kind of witness was gone, the kind that had known the beginning of the story, and could therefore see the full arc of it in a way that no one who came later ever quite could. She felt the loss of that, specifically and clearly. And then she opened her legal pad to a fresh page, because there was work to do, because there was always work to do, because that was what it meant to have built something real, that it required you every day, and the requiring was the point. In October, a year after the divorce, Daniel Morgan called. "I have something for you," he said. "From Charles. He left it separately from the estate, a personal item. I was instructed to hold it for 1 year after the dissolution of the marriage." He sent it by courier the next day. It arrived in a small wooden box with a clasp. Emily opened it at her desk alone on a Tuesday afternoon. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a watch. She recognized it immediately. She had seen it on her grandfather's wrist at every family occasion she could remember from childhood. A simple watch, nothing flashy, with a worn leather strap that he had replaced 3 times over the decades, rather than replace the watch itself. There was a card underneath it. He had written, "For persistence in difficult circumstances, which you have in greater measure than you know. Keep better time than I did. Love, Grandfather." Emily held the watch in both hands. She sat with it the way she had sat with his letter, not rushing, letting it be fully real. She had spent a long time being angry at him. She had spent a long time believing he had abandoned her. She had spent 11 years in a marriage that would not have survived a closer look, living at a careful distance from the family she had left behind, and she had told herself it was her own choice and that she was fine. She had not been fine, but she had been persistent. And her grandfather, watching from whatever distance he maintained, had seen it, had recognized it, had named it the way he named everything he valued, quietly, precisely, and in a form that lasted. She put the watch on. It fit. She looked at it on her wrist for a moment, this object that had measured her grandfather's days and would now measure hers, and she made a decision that she had been approaching for months without fully arriving at it. She called Lisa Tran. "The foundation," Emily said. "I want to expand, not incrementally, significantly. I want programs in 5 cities within 18 months. Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Seattle. Full intake capacity, legal teams, counseling, referral networks. Real infrastructure." Lisa was quiet for a brief moment, the pause of someone absorbing the scale of a thing. "That's a significant undertaking," Lisa said. "Yes," Emily said. "I know. The funding." "I'm committing personal capital," Emily said. "Separate from the company. I've already talked to Daniel about the structure." "Emily," Lisa paused again, "this is going to change the foundation from a New York initiative into a national organization." "Yes," Emily said. "That's the point." She heard Lisa smile through the phone. "Okay," Lisa said. "Let's build it." That evening, Emily went to Clara's apartment for dinner. They sat at Clara's kitchen table with takeout and wine and talked for 3 hours about nothing in particular, about Clara's new job and a book they had both read and a neighborhood restaurant that had just closed that they had both loved for different reasons, and whether Clara was going to spend Christmas with her sister's family or do what she had been threatening to do for 3 years and go somewhere warm and completely alone. At some point late, the wine nearly finished, Clara looked at her and said, "You're different." "I know," Emily said. "Not in a way that's hard to be around," Clara said quickly. "In a way that's you're more yourself, if that makes sense. Like someone turned the volume up to where it was always supposed to be." Emily looked at her friend across the kitchen table and thought about everything they hadn't said to each other in the years of the marriage, all the conversations that hadn't happened because Emily had been slowly contracting into a shape that fit inside someone else's idea of who she was. "It makes sense," she said. She walked home late through the kind of fall night that New York does particularly well, cool and clear, with the city lit up against the dark sky and the streets still busy at 10 o'clock, because the city is always busy, always moving, always generating its own particular argument that life is worth participating in. She thought about Diane, who had called the intake counselor that same afternoon. She'd called Emily and had 3 months later sent the foundation a letter that Emily had read twice and kept in the top drawer of her desk next to her grandfather's letter. She thought about Ruth, who had come to the second foundation event with a friend she had told the whole story to for the first time. She thought about Sandra in Ohio, and Maria in Texas, and Joyce in Seattle, who had thought she was the only one. She thought about this morning of the divorce hearing, standing at her front door with the scratched handbag, the city not waiting for her, walking out anyway. She thought about what Victoria had said on the sidewalk in December. You didn't have nothing. You had exactly what you needed. You just didn't have a name for it yet. She knew its name now. It was not courage exactly, though courage was part of it. It was not resilience, though people would use that word about her and she would accept it. It was not strength in the way the word is typically deployed, as if strength means the absence of being hurt, as if the whole point is to become impervious. She had been hurt. She had been hurt specifically and thoroughly and over a long period of time, and she carried that. She would carry it. The weight of it had not disappeared. It had simply been redistributed into something she had built with it instead of under it. What she had always had, what her grandfather had seen from a distance and named in a letter and confirmed with a watch, was the refusal to make herself smaller than she was. Not the refusal to be hurt, but the refusal to let the hurt become the final definition. The insistence, quiet and consistent, and sometimes barely audible even to herself, that whatever was being taken from her was not the same as who she was. She had been a woman in a simple black dress in a courtroom. She had been a woman with a scratched handbag and a failed business and a nearly empty bank account. She had been a woman who walked out her front door on the worst morning of her life and kept walking. She was Emily Sinclair, and that had always been enough.